Hello and welcome to ATARC's Federal Zero Trust Virtual Summit. For those who do not know, my name is Kirsten Patton and I'm the Working Group Program Manager here at ATARC, and I'll be emceeing today's event. ATARC stands for the Advanced Technology Academic Research Center, and we are a nonprofit that facilitates collaboration between government, industry, and academia in order to accelerate technology modernization initiatives. We provide ongoing opportunities for cross-agency collaboration through on-site interaction, learning, and market research. Thank you to our partners today at AppGate, Beyond Trust, Contrast Security, ForgeRock, Fortinet, ForcePoint, iBoss, Avanti, Menlo Security, Rubrik, Netscope, Palo Alto, Trend Micro, and Vinafi for helping us create today's summit. And of course, I would like to thank you all for joining us. We hope that you enjoy this informative session, and I would like to remind you all that after each panel, there will be time for Q&A, so please send your questions in through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I also want to remind you to please answer the poll questions as they appear throughout the panel discussions in order to ensure that you receive your CPE credit. Up first, to kick us off, I would like to welcome our visionary keynote, the Chief Information Officer for the Office of the Inspector General within the United States Department of Health and Human Services. We have Jerry Caron. Jerry, if you could please come on camera, over to you, sir.
Thanks, Kirsten. It's always an honor to be here. Thanks for having me, and very passionate subject of mine, being zero trust. I also do chair the Zero Trust Working Group here at ATARC as well. It is a working group made up of 25 plus government agencies represented in one form or fashion, and we have 54 vendors participating as well. We've gotten to the point now where those 54 vendors are doing, based on the criteria, requirements, and outline that we have given them in use cases, they are doing every Friday, they are at 11, they are doing presentations. We usually have 2 per Friday, sometimes 1. I think we're about through 6 right now. This Friday, of course, we have Fidelis, Security and Micro Focus Government Solutions doing their zero trust use cases and going through those. They are all recorded and put on ATARC's YouTube channel if you're unable to attend. So the ones that have already occurred, you can go through and watch those if you're interested. Also, there is allowance for follow-up with the individuals after their presentations in the labs that they've created for more direct interaction and follow-up on specific use cases that you may be interested in. So great participation in that group. Been doing it for over a year now. Getting to this point was a big emphasis. And one of the things we found out during the start of the group is when we were talking with the government folks is the definition of zero trust. And I still find, defining zero trust to be a challenge out there, talking with a lot of different agencies, networking a lot, and understanding what true zero trust is. So with that, for these next 2 days, hopefully you'll get, if depending on where you are in your journey, if you're learning what is this zero trust thing, hopefully you'll get some good information there. If you're further along in your zero trust and you understand what your architecture is, what capabilities you need, where your maturity is, you'll get some good information, I'm sure, as well. I would remind folks that this is not just this is a journey. There is not just one tool that you grab off the shelf and you will be zero trusted. It is an integration, it is a journey, it is an architecture made up of a lot of products, a lot of integration, and a lot of understanding. But to remember, we're focused on protecting what's most important, and that's the data, and all data is not created equal. A lot of people ask me, all right, where do I start? Some folks that are still, trying to wrap their head around it, and where to even start, where do I start? So one of the things we've done is here in the federal government, of course, we definitely share the right screen here. We definitely, want to make the most of our investments. So one of the things is what can I do today? So I may be doing it today and then using DHS's maturity model to see how mature I am at doing that capability is important. Or I may have a product that's sitting over here doing something that's either operational and I've never thought of using it. But when I take my capabilities model that I'm showing here that I've been using, then it's like, oh, I could use that potentially for this. So what do I have available? What have I already made investments in that I can leverage, and where does it fit? I've worked with vendors. The vendors that are participating in the ATARC working group are also using this maturity model. We're asking them, okay, the solution that you're presenting, what capabilities does your solution do? The things that I don't find are where my gaps are going to be. And then this is going to allow me, now I know what potential investments can I do with my current investments, where my gaps are. Now I can start drawing out my roadmap. My multi-phased roadmap is the way we're looking at it. And I can prioritize some of these things. You know, some of these things, if I'm doing very good at data loss prevention and I think I'm very mature at it, okay, I can check that. Let's move on to the other thing. The other thing that we're asking vendors as well is, you may not do it directly, but where do you integrate? And when I tell them where do you integrate, it's one or two areas. It can be, if you want to use our solution, we need some kind of authentication so you can access our tools. Okay, so that's a prerequisite. Or, hey, we can provide you risk scoring and telemetry that can integrate with your threat risk scoring, because what we're going to have to do with Zero Trust is we're going to have to take in a lot of factors and understand, you know, based on these number of factors, what is my risk tolerance based on all of these factors and that level of risk? And is it over a threshold? If it is, what action am I going to take it, or am I okay to give them access to this? So very important to understand that this is an integration. Like I said, there's no one tool that's going to come off the shelf. So make the most of your investments. This is a good tool to understand, you know, that I use with vendors as well. What can you do? Where do you fit? And get a good understanding of where your investments are. What do I have? What am I doing? What can I do? Even if I'm not using it for that. So it's very exciting journey. I've been talking about Zero Trust for many years. Now everybody else is getting cool like me, because everybody's talking about it now. So I'm really excited. Definitely check out the working group. Like I said, if you go to the atarc.org website, you'll see the working group there, what's coming up. Like I said, we gave them an outline, we gave them maturity model, what are they covering, go through these use cases, and we're looking really forward to continuing those. Each vendor gets, each of the 54 vendors is getting 75 minutes to do a presentation, followed by question and answer. So there is a question and answer period. It's a great collaboration we've had. I've participated in some other working groups and some other discussions as well, and there's a lot of great collaboration going on around this. So things like what you're going to attend these next 2 days is great. But network, get to know, we're all trying to do the same thing. There's some great collaboration, there's some great working groups out there, so definitely reach out, learn from what others are doing. This is the way of the future. I really believe in Zero Trust from the day that I started hearing about it, around 2015. And I really think this is the right direction to go. It's important though to get a good understanding of where you stand. So definitely check out CIS's maturity model, the capability model. I can provide that. I see a question that I can provide that and send that out for the ATARC to distribute or provide after this session. And if you want to become a member of the working group, Kirsten, if you go to the website and click on the learn more under the Zero Trust Lab, there's I think it has Kirsten's email. You can reach out to her and participate and ask about it. So Kirsten, I don't want to take up much time because, well, I do see a hand raised, so I guess I can take a question if
Sure,
you
if
want to ask.
let's see, are we able to allow an attendee? Well, anyways, if you have a question and you'd like to submit it through the
Put in
Q&A,
the Q&A, yeah.
go ahead and do that. And yes, to your point, I will provide, or Alyssa will provide, it looks like she's already typing the link to go get involved in our demos. Thank you so much, Jerry. This has been awesome as usual. We appreciate it.
I just wanted to share, there's some links here. I can provide these to you, Kirsten, as well, to provide, as well as the last slide that I had.
Yeah, we'll include that in our follow-up email.
Yep. Well, thanks for having me. Enjoy your next 2 days, and I will turn it back over to you so people can start learning and getting smart about Zero Trust.
Thanks so much. All right. So next up, we have our tech talk, and we will be hearing from Steve Reilly, who is the field CTO at Netskope. So Steve, over to you. You are muted, FYI. We'll give Steve a minute.
There we go. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, we
Not like I'm a newbie at this. Let's get the correct application shared here.
Sounds good.
All right. You should all see that.
We do.
Excellent. Welcome to the Zero Trust Virtual Summit, everyone. This morning, we'll explore the necessary steps to build an effective Zero Trust strategy in your environment. We'll investigate a sequence of steps to better help you understand how to shift from a common notion of trust but verify to verify then trust. We'll introduce the importance of continuous adaptive trust, which offers a lot more flexibility than simple binary or allow or block decisions. And we'll learn why eliminating implicit trust is one of the most powerful tools you have to reduce risk and get work done. Before we explore how to devise a Zero Trust strategy, let's review why it matters now more than ever. Applications and data and users have migrated outside of what remains of anything like a perimeter. SaaS applications have become the default for most ordinary work, but somehow it's managed to escape good governance until just very recently. PaaS is likely to prevail for custom applications because, well, managing virtual infrastructure isn't any more efficient than managing physical infrastructure was. We know that some agencies are sprinkling their cloud projects across multiple providers. Now, I think it's difficult enough to become an expert in just one, but the reality is that application requirements and developer proficiency often tilt decisions in different directions. And your employees and your partners need consistent and predictable access to applications wherever they reside and from whatever kind of device. Now, Zero Trust models in all of their slightly varying flavors are a good fit for reducing risk and protecting assets in our new highly distributed information landscape. By assuming that your environment will be breached at some point and then working back from there, your mindset shifts. You'll shrink attack surfaces, limit blast radiuses, constrain lateral movement, and respond to threats with greater speed and accuracy. I'd like you to think of Zero as the starting point. Ultimately, for someone to interact with a resource, some amount of trust needs to be granted. And depending on what happens during the interaction, the amount of trust might need to change. That's why we at Netskope emphasize continuous adaptive trust. Context can change, so it should be continuously evaluated. And depending on the outcome, the amount of trust can then adapt. Context-aware access balances trust and risk and can match the level of trust to the value of the asset being accessed. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that Zero Trust models add some management overhead. Resource owners need to keep on top of who's allowed to access their stuff. Managing entitlements sounds boring, but it's absolutely essential, and it's becoming possible to automate some of it. Resource owners also need to define the attributes and the contextual elements that determine how much trust to extend when someone requests access. More context means a more accurate assessment of trust. So, what do we need in place for Zero Trust to work? It's important to acknowledge that the Zero Trust journey might not be exactly the same for every agency. In fact, your mission and how much cloud you're already using and how people interact with your legacy systems, all will influence not only where you begin your journey, but also the amount of effort that's necessary. A few simple steps can help every agency prepare. Start with some foundational work that will put you in the mindset of thinking about people, roles, applications, data, and identity. Take some time to uncover the typical mission roles at your agency. You'll probably need to interview folks from all your departments. Use this as an opportunity to refresh your knowledge of how your agency's departments have configured themselves for today's work. Then devise a set of user personas that reflect typical mission roles and make a list of all of the common access requirements. Your agency uses a lot of applications, and you might even have a list someplace. But like that old list of roles, your list of applications is most likely out of date. A Zero Trust projects work best when your list is current. Take an inventory of all the private applications and all the SaaS applications that people in your agency use. Create a map showing how these applications and their components interact with each other and with any resources that are external to your agency. A full Zero Trust strategy intimately connects users to the data they need, only when they need it, and only with the amount of trust needed for that individual interaction. So for every data asset in your agency, document its location, its sensitivity level, its mission function, and its intended lifetime. I promise you'll find this exercise useful as your Zero Trust strategy evolves. Also, a successful Zero Trust strategy demands a robust identity and access management program. Every entity must present an identity that every other entity can validate. Most modern systems are compatible with common standards like SAML, OIDC, and OAuth, which is a necessary capability. One notion to explore is directory federation. If you federate your identity system with, say, a partner's identity system, then you won't need to create accounts in your system for your partner's people. You can move your partner's people into and out of roles as often as necessary. Now, with the basics in place, we can begin our journey. We want to eliminate anonymous access and remove implicit trust. We want a model that grants explicit trust based on context and purpose. We can reduce opportunities for lateral movement, and we can conceal applications from being fingerprinted, port scanned, probed for vulnerabilities. Start with defining your source of truth for identity and, as I mentioned earlier, what other identity sources they might federate. Establish when strong authentication is required. My suggestion is to require MFA for just about all forms of access. Now you have choices: phone apps, biometrics, FIDO2 security keys. Just try to avoid SMS, of course. Assign your internal users and your partner users to roles, and then map these roles to the applications that people use. Remember to remove stale entitlements that aren't required anymore. You'll need to maintain regular conversations with your departments to learn about role changes, departures, contract terminations, and so on. I actually suggest you nominate a specific set of individuals to carry this responsibility. There's one more architectural change, and it's significant. Remove direct access to applications. Define all access policies in a central location, then enforce those policies everywhere consistently. How can you do this? Steer your traffic through devices like Zero Trust Network Access for private and internal applications, Cloud Access Security Brokers for SaaS applications, and secure web gateways for the internet. Building a strategy around centralized policy decision and distributed policy enforcement confers many advantages. A useful outcome is a view into user behavior, threat activity, and application sprawl. ZTNAs and CASPs and SWIGs create useful dashboards and reports that you can use to demonstrate to your auditors, your regulators, and your citizens or customers that you're effectively governing your entire environment. One of the first signals to incorporate into adaptive policies is to determine whether a user's device is managed or unmanaged. Users on managed devices present less risk than users on unmanaged ones. Previously, I suggested that you should require MFA for just about all forms of access. Is it ever okay to drop this requirement? Well, if a managed device interacts with a local application in read-only mode, then possibly. Ultimately, though, you should Allow the unmanaged versus managed signal to reflect your risk tolerance. Another signal worth evaluating is user behavior. Users who display predilections toward more risky behavior could be gently coached towards specific approved applications. Now, context isn't only the user identity and device status, it's also the device identity, the device security posture, the time of day, the geolocation of the user, and maybe even user and application risk scores. Negative signals that indicate elevated risk are what differentiate truly adaptive policies from simple conditional authentication based on familiarity or recognition. Conditional authentication isn't enough to thwart the rise in fraud and malicious activity. Adaptive access requires insight into what happens after the login. Now, adaptive access isn't set and forget. Applications evolve, new ones arrive, and old ones are decommissioned. Think of this as a way to offer shades of access, straddling the balance between staying secure and getting work done. Isolation is another useful strategy. Remote browser isolation can work in two modes. The more common one is to isolate sites that are too risky to interact with directly. To the user, everything acts pretty much as usual. The isolation session just sends a pixel stream to the user's browser. Sessions typically prohibit downloads and uploads, but depending on the capabilities of the service, you might decide to allow these activities. The less common direction is to isolate risky users. Mostly, this means users on unmanaged devices. Browser isolation that works this way presents another approach to making internal applications available without exposing them directly on the internet, and it protects those applications from potentially compromised browsers. One other technique for containing the blast radius is to enable an on-device firewall. Now, most operating systems already include basic inbound firewalls. They block traffic that isn't the response to an outbound request, but they allow all outbound requests. So here, what I mean is a firewall that runs on your managed devices and controls outbound requests to constrain the devices from even accessing certain kinds of known bad sites for all ports and all protocols. Typically, in these policies, you can include sources, destinations, users, and groups. In return, the device firewall generates yet more activity that can help you identify anomalous behavior and reduce threats. Now, you might already have a DLP product in your network. DLP is useful, but an important prior step is to identify and classify all data. It's easier to control the movement of sensitive information if you have a consistent way to label it. Investigate tools that can automatically classify data and ensure that other products comprising your zero trust strategy can interact with those labels. Now, with this in place, you can create policies that combine context and content. For example, a policy for unmanaged devices might allow full access to public content, read-only access to sensitive content, and no access at all to confidential content. Now, I've described several layers of control that can reduce accidental or malicious exposure without invoking any DLP rules. I don't want to minimize the importance of DLP. It's absolutely essential for monitoring where information is flowing. But a continuous adaptive approach to access and protection takes some of the pressure off DLP. It doesn't have to do all the heavy lifting. Now, that said, some people make mistakes, or they just might want to bend the rules a little. DLP remains crucial for detecting these incidents and responding to them. You'll want to scan for DLP violations both inline and at rest. Now, inline applies mostly to SaaS applications and to web traffic. It helps ensure that sensitive information remains in approved places and doesn't move to unapproved ones. At rest applies to all types of clouds, SaaS, PaaS, and IaaS. A good use in PaaS and IaaS is to ensure that sensitive information doesn't remain in a storage object with public access. And speaking of which, I can't go on without mentioning my favorite capability, ensuring that all of our clouds are correctly configured. Now, I recognize that IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS security posture management might seem only tangentially related to zero trust. It remains the case, though, that the vast majority of cloud security incidents are the result of configuration mistakes. Some of these mistakes are trust related, An object's permission might be too broad, or security principles' rights might be overly scoped. Posture management tools offer a ton of useful features. Identifying and removing implicit trust is at the top of that feature list. Now, your zero trust program won't survive for long if you can't demonstrate its effectiveness. You should continuously monitor the risk associated with every application and site you use, every activity within those applications, and every user in your agency. Guide people toward approved, high-quality applications, place guardrails around risky sites and activities, and nudge people away from dangerous habits. A real-time analytics engine will generate useful insights that simple statistics simply can't illustrate. Now, some of you might be wondering, is this zero trust stuff worth the effort? Yes, you can achieve your mission goals without making security trade-offs. You can attain improved mission agility through harmonized user experience, location independence, more opportunities to say yes with conditions rather than no, and increased collaboration with suppliers and partners. You can reduce risk by shielding applications from the internet, constraining inappropriate access, improving visibility of sensitive data movement, and producing analytics to neutralize threats. And of course, these outcomes require the right architecture. What is that right architecture? It's a cloud-native security service that scales as your missions grow. It's a single platform driven by a single console with single path inspection and enforcement to apply consistent policy across all channels. I'm Steve Reilly, Field CTO for Netscope. After the event, we'll send everyone attending some resources that further explore Netscope's approach to zero trust. Thank you for joining, and enjoy the remainder of the event.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was awesome. Next up, we have our first panel of the day, which will be moderated by Jory Heckman. So Jory, over to you.
Thanks, Kirsten. And we have a great panel lined up here. Welcome once again from the Federal News Network studios here, getting out of the apartment and doing this still not quite in person, but the next best thing here. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get started here. I do want to encourage the audience to please keep questions coming here throughout the panel. 30 minutes will go by so quickly, and so I want to make sure that we aren't rushing to get that done at the end here. And so with that being said, I do want to introduce the panel here. We have Ramesh Menon, the Chief Technology Officer for the Defense Intelligence Agency, Andre Mendez, the Chief Information Officer for the Commerce Department, and Michael Friedrich, the Vice President for Federal Technology Strategy and Innovation at AppGate. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you. And I think a good place to get started here would just be if you could perhaps introduce yourselves a little more fulsomely here, and perhaps give us a better understanding of what's top of mind for you right now when it comes to zero trust.
Ramesh, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure, I can go. Thank you. Hello, team. So I would say zero trust first is a journey. And as our speaker previously mentioned, it is understanding where we have implicit trust and make it explicit trust. That's the first step, I would say, right? Really understand the trust part. And it goes across multiple layers from identity, endpoint, networks, applications, data, infrastructure, the policy analytics. And there are certain basic things anybody could do, right? Obviously, understanding the trust levels and explicitly trusting all these layers, and also reducing the risk by focusing on macro and micro segmentation. So there are not exfiltrations and APTs in your network, so we can be more secure. Obviously, off late, there's been enough cyber incidents, and this is a good journey, I would say, but make it relevant to your agencies or your companies. And don't forget about the user experience. I know security and user experience is always an interesting thing. If your HR manager and marketing manager likes what you're doing, I think it's a good project.
All right, great. Thanks for that, Ramesh. And I think we're going to throw it over to Andre next, if you will. Andre, take it away.
Sure. Obviously, the Department of Commerce, with its multiple bureaus and the diversity of the bureaus in terms of size, mission, and everything else, present a complex environment in terms of zero trust architecture, because we want to make sure that it operates within the bureaus, but also across commerce-wide. And historically, we have not been very good at establishing that common baseline, common platforms, common structures, common nomenclatures, and common metadata that allows us to operate at a agency or department environment. And so our efforts have been focusing on bringing our experts across the entire set of bureaus into a common environment. We literally put them in a room for about 3 months on a regular basis and said, you are going to design the next generation of zero trust architecture that is going to be adopted across the entire Department of Commerce. Some original reluctance, they were not used to working in that type of environment. They were very focused on their own issues within their bureau. But over time, that resulted in a plan that we've submitted to both OMB and Congress in terms of funding, that I think it's very, very coherent, very cogent, and that effectively brings us into a place where there is the lowest common denominator is at a very high level. Because one of the things that we want to do with zero trust architecture is not only, of course, secure our networks and the environments and systems to a much higher degree, but also enable, by virtue of that security, an enormous amount of data commingling and interchange across the bureaus, because that is, the essence of the collaboration that we can bring to the table. Because even though these missions might be so different, at least at first sight, they contain data that can be leveraged and be synergistic in terms of its interaction to provide the American taxpayer with a much more integrated view of commerce and what it does and how it enables the growth of the U.S. economy.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Of course, Commerce Department is a large federated agency, but to your point, making sure that there's a common foundation for zero trust. And Mike, we'll kick it over to you. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and what's currently top of mind for you in terms of zero trust these days?
Sure. So my name is Michael Friedrich, and as noted, I'm the Vice President for Technology and Innovation for AppGates Federal Group. As a company, we focus obsessively on zero trust, but it's not just the idea of the network. It's zero trust as it relates to your cloud, whether it's on-prem, whether it's off-prem, whether it's Kubernetes, whether it's DevSecOps. We're looking at the idea of zero trust and trying to help agencies understand the mission. Right? Because everything is, the two other speakers said, it's about the mission, it's about the data, it's about that people-defined sense of security and data, and you can't sacrifice one or the other. So my big talk with agencies these days really has to do with, first, start with the most basic idea. Do you have a good idea of your IAM, right? Dr. Chase Cunningham just recently gave an interview where he said that was actually one of the hardest things industry and government talked about in his survey. Identity and access management are the beginning of zero trust. If you don't understand that and where your data is and who your users are, this goes nowhere in a hurry. So you've got to start with that. But then you also need to look at the processes of a mature organization. What is it on day one? What is it on day end, right? How is your map going to get you there? What are those technologies? Because you can't just pick up and throw things out. Right? I mean, that's been the biggest fear as I talk to agencies. Oh, I've invested in a PAM. I've invested in IDS, DLP, IPS. I just can't throw these things out, but I need them to work better. And so helping them understand zero trust actually is about making them work better, integrating them. And so one of the big talks I have with them is about establishing standards. No more silos. Agencies have to start setting a minimum acceptable standard. You want to do business with me? You better have a robust API. You better be near real time. You better be able to make all these solutions fit together, because a zero trust is an architecture. It's not just network access. It's not just layer 7. It's a total solution. And so I spend my time talking to agencies about their strategy and how they think that fits together. And I try to approach this from a technology point of view, right? If AppGate's the technology they go with, that's great. I'm glad to help them. But I also want them to understand their mission, right? And there are other technologies that fit into their scheme, and they need to figure out what that is, right? So in the end, I view this as part of the mission to help our government be more secure. I happen to think AppGate's a way to do it, but I also know that they've got other technologies, and I need to help them understand how they fit together.
Yeah, no, setting the bar high for everyone. I think that's a takeaway we can all appreciate there. Thank you for that, Michael. And I think just to kind of get the ball rolling here in terms of the conversation, one thing that I'm particularly mindful of these days is this weird in between with COVID-19 and the kind of the workplace of the future here. Of course, we're at a point where agencies are still figuring out what that future is, right? I mean, telework is still here to stay in some way, shape, or form. And so, I'm trying to, I guess, reconcile that piece of things with the zero trust piece of things. Of course, understanding that the workforce is not necessarily going to be in the office 100% of the time, and you might not see those trusted workers on a daily basis, but, I'll throw it out to everyone and see who wants to take it first. How do you kind of reconcile those two things, the idea of telework and a more remote workforce gelling with this idea of zero trust and making sure that, the folks who need to get onto the network are able to do so expeditiously, but at the same time, making sure that permissions are managed in such a way that malicious actors are not getting on the network?
So I'll take it, and then so I find it interesting that question keeps coming up. I will tell you that for me, that is almost a non-issue, right? Because here's the basic premise. We are a distributed environment. ITA, for example, has offices all over the world, right? Including offices in China, in various locations in China, right? And so the level of security that we have had to add all this time for that type of environment has allowed for remote work, especially because we were 100% cloud-based. So effectively, where they were really didn't make any difference, right? We were also very aggressive in terms of telework policy, right? So they were always in that environment where we needed to support people, regardless of where they were, with a high level of security. The big difference here is that previously, the overwhelming majority of the time, people relied on VPNs, right? And the concept of a VPN is something that it, of course, evolved over time, and it was perceived to be the way to secure the environment. But effectively, in a lot of ways, it was a way to ensure that if somebody got in, they got in behind the firewall and could actually do all of the damage in the world, right? I mean, there's a reason why the Trojan horse is still talked about, a few hundreds of or thousands of years later, because of the damage that it inflicted. And so in this environment, it doesn't matter where you are, right? We don't trust you. With every keystroke that you take, we don't trust you. I don't care if you're in the office next to me, if you are in the data center, or if you are across the globe in the antipoda of Washington, D.C., somewhere in New Zealand or Papua New Guinea, right? You are not trusted unless you certify and we can verify that you are indeed allowed to do what you're trying to do on a transaction by transaction basis. So to me, location, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. It just, you just gotta be, not trusted all of the time.
That is so prescient as a point, right? Which is that's the basis of zero trust, right? Which is, I don't trust you. I don't trust your device. I don't want to ever have to think that you're okay. I want to verify, but I need to come back to a point I hit up front, which is it's not the point in time. Zero trust is an ongoing process. So it shouldn't just be that I signed in and I got trusted. It should be that data classification level of I'm in Papua New Guinea, but I'm trying to access information that may be more sensitive. Maybe I need to be continually reevaluated of maybe I'm not supposed to be accessing this after work hours in Papua New Guinea on this device. The zero trust architecture needs to be nimble enough to understand those flexibilities and react as the risk level changes. So that integration piece really becomes critical to making it flexible enough so it doesn't suffer VPN brittleness, right? The other piece that needs to be talked about when moving away from these VPN technologies is the edges. VPNs have been exploited again and again and again because it's not hard to do a Shodan search, find out what they're running, see what iOS is on that device, and go grab the latest exploit pack, and you're in. Now you just have to see how bad the firewall rules were set up by the agency, because it's just, there's so many rules and so many systems and so many places that it just simply impacts performance, it impacts flexibility. A true system, if you're really moving into zero trust, should take the edges away. It should hide them, because now you become invisible. Now you can use public internet as a route and not have to pay for things the government doesn't need, right? So all of those things need to be part of that journey, but your points are so spot on, right? And we need to move away from this notion that sitting at their desk is the only way. That's just not true. How do you attract great workers? You open up the ability to find them anywhere, as long as you can define what is trust and what they should have access to. It should not be defined by that. Now, there are certain spaces that Ramesh is going to rightfully say, hey, we're talking about, SIPRnet and JWIX. There's no way we're putting that on the public internet, rightfully so. But within within commerce's mission, you hopefully don't have that kind of information where people could die, and you should absolutely be embracing it in Ramesh's mission, where it's not critical data. I believe the DoD is already taking those strides. If you look at what's out there, the DoD CIO has already released reference architectures on DevSecOps, on Zero Trust. DISA has, OMB has stuff out there. This is not going away, and that's exciting.
No, that's a good feedback, team. I would say primarily, COVID has forced us to relook how we conduct our businesses. We are all learning and evolving and adapting to the new normal. And there are other macro trends happening, the changing demographics, the great resignations that you're seeing in the newspapers. So there are multiple things happening. And as you rightly mentioned, Michael, I mean, DoD is a bit more complicated. We have classified networks, unclassified networks. But I think we are embracing a hybrid work model on the unclassified networks, where we can attract new talent and try to do the work where it is, and also being more creative. Can I make someone work in a military base next to their home instead of forcing them to relocate to Washington, D.C.? So there are multiple ways we could do, even on the classified side. So we are trying to be creative. So it's about preparedness, readiness, and ability to compete in the era of great strategic competition. That's where we are moving as a Department of Defense, as we are moving away from counterterrorism to the next big thing, and making sure we have the talent to make sure the country is prepared for the next big things, and we are always prepared as a nation.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Ramesh. And I think it's time for our first poll question of the panel here. Alyssa, if you could just get that going. And we'll get that loaded up in just a second here. Well, maybe we'll get back to that in just a little bit here. I'll actually kind of throw a related question here in the mix, because we've been talking about this not just being like a one and done. This isn't a checkbox you can do. Zero trust is really a shift in mindset, and it's everything else that's associated with that. One thing that I think has really kind of made zero trust a going concern for a lot of agencies is, of course, the recent Biden executive order on cybersecurity. And, I think federal CISO Chris DeRusha has made it pretty clear that this is going to be more than just the 60-day, 90-day, 120-day mandates here. This is going to be something that's going to be on the administration's mind for the next 3 years. And so when you look at it in that way, you look at it in that longer term view, what perhaps has been elevated from that EO in terms of zero trust now, and what are going to be the kinds of things, whether it's a culture stand-up, whether it's a technology stand-up, what are the kind of things that are really going to be the biggest lifts over the next couple of years?
So, I think that the EO happened to focus, focus the attention of everybody on the necessity to implement this. I think that although there had been plenty of reasons why this should have been considered, and for example, at ITA, this had been an implementation that started almost 3 years ago, right? There wasn't sort of the impetus, and there was also not the understanding, potentially on the Hill, of the need for funding this effort, on a whole of government basis, because it's so important from that standpoint. So for us, the EO was very much a focusing point for the rest of the bureaus. The other thing that was important for us was NIST's SP 800-207. That really provided the framework, that really provided, a lot of the guidance and direction, and sort of the rail lines for us to embrace and to start implementing. And so, one thing is to have, iconoclasts and mavericks out there going out and basically doing some of the forward-thinking, and forward-thinking implementations. The other is to have a whole of government, a whole of departments, a whole of agencies mindset that this is no longer optional. This is something that you have to do. Right? And so get your game in gear and go out there and get it done, with the proviso that you're going to need funding in order to get that done. But I think that from that standpoint, that EO was fundamentally important in establishing that momentum and that urgency.
From an industry point of view, we're waiting to see how the cyber bill comes through, probably much like yourselves in government. The cyber bill is kind of the money, right? You don't want to end up with an HSPD 12 where 15 years in, adoption's still at like 60 or 70%, right? You want to have the money and you want to have realistic time-bound goals, right? Saying you got to have it all done in 90 days, that's just not going to happen. Just the data classification, the identity and access management piece, those take time, but the journey has to start. There has to be steps. They have to be measurable. And Congress needs to step up and do this in a way that makes sense. They can't just throw it out there and pretend agencies are going to turn on a dime. This is going to be a journey, and we all need to recognize there's going to be more breaches along the way, but zero trust is more than just this. It also needs to go into how things get developed. That's part of your zero trust journey, right? Agencies need to understand that the software they're using is safe and secure. There cannot be another SolarWinds. The damage is too widespread and will probably never really be fully known. So that's part of that trust journey, and Congress has got to help by funding agencies to allow that to happen along the way. I mean, that from an industry point of view, we can talk to you all day and night, but if you don't have the money to match the goodwill of what you want to do, it's very hard to execute.
I would also talk about the importance of automation in the development process, because some of the security requirements, non-functional requirements, can be embedded into your software factories, in your DevSecOps processes. So it becomes a lot easier for your CISO to approve and grant ATOs onto systems, right? It is not an after the fact event. People have to ensure that a application, project, system, there are common things that IT or CISO or CIO provides, but there are things that a application developer and the specific application team has to do, and that is leveraging the non-functional requirements that is coming from the security team upfront in the development process. And as far as possible, I would recommend automating that. So then if I'm not compliant to specific some requirements, I can't even check in my code. I mean, one of the DoD agencies did that, and it has significantly reduced the ATO cycle time. So I would say security is everyone's work, and especially where I sit, we are also foundational military intelligence. We work with our partners in different countries, and we need to make sure that we are always prepared for our missions and we can leverage these technologies. And more important, evolution of data centers. So the traditional data centers are evolving into software-defined data centers with the augmentation with hybrid multi-clouds. So we really need to understand what does that mean and how does that impact your development life cycle. And I think it's a journey, but there are two parts of it. There's the program and funding part, which is done at a CIO or centralized level. There's also a distributed function that each project team has to incorporate by leveraging these non-functional requirements upfront in their project.
That is such a great point. Brilliant. For standards. Brilliant. You know, you, as government entities, you need to, I said this at the top, you guys need to enforce standards, robust APIs, but modes that you can operate in. If you can't deliver this to me to operate as code so I can bake it into my DevSecOps process, then why are they talking to you? Because all they're doing is creating more human time, more delay, less reactive, near real-time systems. That is such a great point in that process. And you're right, the DoD has already taken the lead in this in some really significant ways. And I mean, one of the great software factories the DoD is using is up at Kessel Run. I mean, that is a great example of building in that process up front for everything as code. And I congratulate the leadership coming out of that, because it's going to lead to better things.
Yeah, no, absolutely brilliant points, Ramesh. It really brings into focus the fact that a zero trust architecture environment, it has to be holistic in nature. It has to be baked into everything that you do. And one of the things that's very important for us, in terms of that, is matching it with our IPv6 implementation, right? And with software-defined networks, so that we effectively have a borderless network that encompasses the globe, and that sets sort of the baseline for that. But then when you talk about the software integration, it's got to be baked in. It cannot be an afterthought. And so Ramesh's point is absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, I think we're all hitting on the same kind of DevSecOps conversation here without actually saying explicitly, but I think the point is well taken there. I think it's time for our second and final poll question, if we can get that loaded up here. All right, is anyone seeing that?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. For some reason, I am not seeing the poll question. So if someone could just give me a little ping to see when the results are rolling in.
Results
okay. The results are up. All right. Well, I usually read these out, but I will take your word for it that it is completed here. And so, I think let's maybe pull on that thread a little bit more in terms of the DevSecOps thread of all of this, in terms of making sure that, security is baked into everything that is developed, everything that is plugged into the network, as it's being worked on here. What are the considerations that agencies should I guess really be mindful of when it comes to, zero trust? And again, recognizing that this is going to be something on the horizon for the next 3 years, at least for them.
I'll defer to the agency folks first. I have my opinions, but I'll be curious to hear how they do it.
Ramesh, why don't you take that?
I can start. So basically it's a speed, right? We need speed and scale of innovation, and we need to provide the underlying frameworks, technologies, tools, and process. So I would say it's a tool chain automation, and which enables certain capabilities like CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous development. Now, while doing this, creating this capability, how do we ensure that we are not missing out on the underlying non-functional requirements, which is critical for zero trust and to get your ATOs out the door? So while we focus on speed and simplicity, we also need to make sure that the security is considered and we are making it easy, simple, but also more secure. And that's the underlying principle, I would say. And that's what most of us are doing. Now, there is a cultural change to it. People create their applications in different perspectives. I mean, we also have large vendor and partner ecosystem. And when RFPs go out, we need to make sure that these non-functional requirements are included in that. We are providing some guidance and standards on how things are being developed, tested, integrated. And there are some new things, like if you're building an artificial intelligence application, what is the verification validation? How do we make sure there is no bias in those kind of things? So there are a lot of changes happening. The technology landscape is changing, and we are all evolving and adapting and doing it in a responsible, safe way, at the same time without losing the core capability we are trying to work towards.
Yep. And so I think that this is the next step in terms of, relying on abstraction layers in order to bring to the table agility, right? Unfortunately, I've been around long enough where, some of the functions that we absolutely take for granted now had to be coded individually, right? And so what we've seen over the last 40 years is the creation of abstraction layers at every step in the architecture. And I think that zero trust, matches right into this. There should be a built-in environment that, to a certain degree, provides the rails for every single application to be developed along, so that the application developers no longer have to worry about that, because it is taken care and automated, as Ramesh mentioned, right? So that it becomes less of an issue because you have to follow along the rails. And therefore, you can concentrate on the upper layer of functionality, the one where you're going to design the software, design the systems that enable each one of our departments and agencies to actually perform that mission, rather than constantly focusing on all of the other layers of the architecture that have now been automated, they have been discretely created, they have been interfaced properly so that they can continue to evolve with one place being removed by another, while at the same time you are focusing on the upper layer where the value is. Because the value of all of these systems is nowhere in the stack except in the functionality layer, right? And this is another step in ensuring that that is ever present, and that allows you to focus all of your energy or most of your energy on that particular functionality.
So the word from the vendor world for what you guys just described when I hear that is metadata. You want to live and die by the metadata that automation drives, whether that's CI/CD, so you're storing everything in a Git repo, and you want to commit your code and you want your security to be committed as part of it, or whether you're trying to read tags for dynamic resolution. All of that is metadata, right? And that's really what it is, right? So zero trust and metadata, they're the same now. And that's a good thing, right? Because all of the major, whether it's a private on-prem cloud or whether it's a public cloud, they all have metadata, tons of it. All these solutions that exist have tons of metadata. So how does the government take that forward now? I actually just recently put out a blog about this. It's called a data lake. Normalization. They need to stop caring about where it came from, bring it in, normalize it, and push it out via metadata. Automation, automation, automation. Live and die by it, because it's what will make SolarWinds not happen. When you take those things together, you can now see those things happening in near real time and react to them. They're not going to get in there. They're not going to do what they did. Wow. It's a journey.
So what I'm hearing is microservices. I'm hearing that there's a need to be agile in deploying a zero trust solution, and you're going to see microservices prevailing in your software as a service types of implementations. So having any, what I heard earlier from Ramesh as well as Andre, I'm hearing this need to have a push button solution. And I think with your SASE implementations, you're going to see more of that, something that's built in the cloud, that's FedRAMP certified. That way you can address any of your concerns about accreditation. And I'm also hearing about, since we're talking about DevSecOps, containerization is also another good strategy, right? Looking at solutions that are containerized, because that gives you not just the ability to exist in the cloud, but to be on-prem, to be portable, right? And with containerization in a DevSecOps pipeline, you have this ability to create containers that can then be certified and go through the process and have very little changes needed as they go through this constant vetting.
Absolutely. One final point. I think we should explicitly verify the software in our supply chains, because that's equally important. Not implicit trust, explicitly verify the software in our supply chains, because that will prevent a lot of unwanted issues down the lane.
Yep. And to the point just made about containers, 100% agree. They're not going away. They're growing. Not accounting for a containerized strategy around zero trust, that's a mistake.
All right. Well, sorry.
Can I mention one thing, Jory? So the point that Michael Friedrich just made is absolutely essential, right? In terms of any and all future systems and current systems, metadata is as important as data. Okay, because automation is absolutely predicated on having this marriage between data that is accurate and metadata that appropriately describes it, so it can interface with everything. Every single system that you see out there right now that is the latest rage is enabled by metadata. Look at video streaming, for example, right? This is a concept that will be totally and completely impossible in an original broadcast world, and now it's par for the course, right? Because of what? Because of metadata. Because you can rely on knowing exactly what the title is and all of those things, right? So this is extremely important. Between Ramesh's automation, conversation and Michael Friedrich's, importance of metadata, this is brilliant. This is absolutely brilliant. It's great to work with panelists like this. I'll tell you that. It's fantastic.
Yeah, well, I mean, automation is a huge part of it, and Andre, you really did a great job kind of drawing out the main points here. I think we're at the 1 minute mark, the lightning round here. So I'll just give everyone, roughly, 20 to 30 seconds here to maybe bring up something that they wanted to quick mention, or perhaps underline or foot stomp something they said earlier. Just some key takeaways, I suppose, for the audience.
Ramesh, you want to take the
Yeah,
first one?
sure. I would say very simple, right? Challenge your assumptions. I know work has been done in certain way over the years, but please continue to challenge your assumptions and creativity and innovation that makes our country great.
Yep. Status quo is the biggest threat and the biggest enemy. It must be fought on a constant basis. It is an evolutionary concept that's been around for a couple of billion years and will serve us well to continually adopt it and work on it.
And I'll take the last one here from that point, which is focus on interoperability. Stop focusing on the solution in a silo. Focus on how is it going to make the mission better. Whether you happen to be somebody from the commercial world watching this, or a government agency, or you're a member of the DIB or some system integrator. Focus on solutions that make the government stronger, better, more reactive. Stop focusing on the next silo.
All right. Well, I think we'll have to leave it here. But Ramesh, Andre, Michael, thank you, all three of you, for contributing your thoughts here this morning and for kicking off the rest of the day here. It's been a great conversation, and unfortunately, it is all the time we have here today. But I think that should do it. And Kirsten, I'll throw it back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Fantastic conversation. All right, up next, we will be hearing from another emerging technology talk. And this time we get to hear from Nicholas Lesson, the Principal Solutions Architect over at ForcePoint, and David White, the Solution Specialist over at ForcePoint as well. Gentlemen, over to you two, if you would like to come on camera and come off mute.
Yes, good morning.
Hi.
I'm having some camera issues. Give me a sec. But good morning.
Good morning.
We have a couple slides to present. We were advised that you were going to bring those up. Would you like me to?
I do not have any slides, but if ATARC has them, we could bring them up. Or we'll wait a minute as you guys pull them up.
Give me just 1 second here. It looks like we're having a technical issue.
Sounds good. Everyone has their coffee. Okay, I'm getting notice that we are working on getting the slides up at this time. So thank you all for hanging on there.
I'm having trouble getting them up on my side. We were advised that you have them and you were going to bring them up. Is that not the case? I mean, we can go ahead and proceed. I know we're killing time here, so.
Someone has them up now. So just a moment and we'll make this presented bigger, please.
It's like we're almost there.
All right, almost there. Don't worry, we'll give you guys a little bit of an extension with the time.
Probably they look like they're coming up empty. Maybe we should pivot and let me, I'm sorry about this.
That's okay. Go ahead and I don't know who was doing that behind the scenes, but let's let ForcePoint do their slide.
Yeah, just make sure I have the share capability. We use Zoom all the time, so Give me just one moment here.
Okay. There they are. They look great.
See my screen okay?
I can, yes.
All right. So let's go ahead and kick this off, just so we're not delayed anymore. So this is Nick and I here. You know, and I think we've got our bios out there. We're happy to be here today. We've been talking about Zero Trust extensively over the last couple of years. Nick and I have been actually, you know, in terms of the tenets and concepts of Zero Trust for quite a long time now, even before it kind of became the latest buzzword salad. You know, and most people don't realize how long Zero Trust has been around. It's actually, you know, from its original genesis, it was in 2007 with the concept of perimeterless security. And, you know, what does that mean for the, you know, the future next generation of cybersecurity? It's, you know, you think about that almost, you know, 12, 13 years ago. And, you know, here we are going through the concept in terms of how do we kind of change the wheels on a moving train. And that's essentially, you know, what we're trying to do today. And, you know, I think there's a lot of various models out there in terms of that have, you know, have come to the surface since Zero Trust has become much more popular from a concept perspective, post Sunburst, with SolarWinds, as well as COVID. I think what's really helped more recently is when OMB and CISA has put out some guidance, you know, because when you start thinking about the various models out there, and, you know, originally started with, you know, Forrester, and then Gartner came out with SASE and kind of the ZTNA concept, and then, you know, NIST and NSA and DoD, et cetera, et cetera. And it's really what it comes down to is understanding the core concepts. It's as our last speakers were just indicating, you know, it's not about the stack or the physical architecture necessarily. Those things are important and they contribute to Zero Trust, but it's really about that journey. I think that's really caught on in recent months compared to where it was a year ago, where, you know, we were doing a lot of educating about what the Zero Trust concept was. And I think, you know, the takeaway is that, sorry, I'm having a little bit of a technical issue here. The takeaway there is that our customers in the government space have become much more educated. They're really digging in on Zero Trust and what that means for their organizations. And as I said, it's like moving a ship in a harbor in some context, but, you know, there's a lot of investment that's already been made around, you know, some of the technologies that contribute to Zero Trust. And so when OMB and CISA came out with this, when you look in kind of the far left column with that traditional, this is where most of the status quo is today. And, you know, as you start to move to the right, going from a more mature model, you know, as you're advancing the capabilities of Zero Trust and getting to that more optimal state. And you'll see on the very far right where the visibility, you know, in terms of understanding what is actually happening at the most singular granular level is really going to be amplified through the analytics and automation. And I think, you know, just the running theme, even from your last guest, and we would reiterate, is really getting that fine-grained understanding of what's happening at the account level. And I think there's a tremendous amount of focus right now on kind of the top two, identity and network, probably the most on the identity part of it. That's where it really starts. It's like the tip of the spear. But, you know, we often ask our customers, okay, your employees or contractors have authenticated in to your boundary, whatever that is today, how you define that. Then what? What do you do next? And this is really kind of the impetus of what we're talking about here today, is the continuous evaluation, the risk adaptive approach that you need to take to effectively implement, you know, Zero Trust, you know, across the enterprise. We at ForcePoint, we have a number of capabilities that align to the various tenets of Zero Trust. But, you know, we also recognize it takes an ecosystem. It's a village that puts us together. It's really all these various technologies working together. It's not about the stack, it's how it comes together into understanding the risk at the most finite level. And you really do that, and something that we've been talking about for a long time, for years, in fact, is the center of that is really around that analytics component. And that's one of the reasons why OMB and CISA put out that component should be the foundation across all these various tenants or these pillars. Sometimes they're referred in a zero trust environment. So as I promised a few minutes ago, we're going to focus on the identity part of it, because that's really where most of our government agencies are spending some time, in terms of where that is really the tip of the spear, and what we're doing with vendors in terms of how we integrate that across the spectrum of zero trust. And with that, I'll pass the baton to you, Nick.
Thanks, Dave. So you heard earlier in the panel discussion about the importance of metadata. And we also talked a lot about the challenges of implementing zero trust. What we'd like to continue this conversation on is what to do with that metadata, and also how to determine trust. I think that a lot of folks in organizations are looking really deeply into their ICAM systems for solutions, and they're going to see that there are many interesting data sets that they can derive from these systems. And so it's important to understand what these particular ICAM systems can provide individually, and then how you can leverage that information. And on the topic of determining trust, it goes back to what my colleague just talked about. There needs to be technology that is capable of determining what a user or device is doing as it continuously interacts with data across the enterprise. And this technology is often referred to as a trust engine in many of the publications that you've seen out there, whether it's from Forrester, whether it's from NIST or DoD. And those trust engines are typically associated with some type of analytics capability. And so there's a need to be able to get some really fine-grained metadata, as was mentioned in a previous panel, and have that information then fed to some type of system serving as that trust engine, aka an analytics engine. And so when we look at the data feeds that are commonly focused on, especially from organizations that start with an identity first strategy for zero trust, you can see that those types of data come from various sources that comprise what an ICAM stack looks like. Starting from left to right, you have your authentication popular vendors, right? You've got Duo, RSA, Ubico, and they're looking at your token-based authentication and things to establish what you have, right? What you have aspect of the authentication process. Moving along, you're seeing your Oktas, your pings, and even your Azure capabilities where you're going to do single sign-on, and you're going to be getting events based on what the user's applications that they're connecting to, where they're coming from. You're going to get very interesting traffic on that. And then as you focus on the privileged user, you're going to be looking at your PAM systems, your privileged access management systems, and that's your CyberArks, your Thycotics, Centrify, and there's many other players in all of these areas. So don't feel limited to these, but that's where you're going to get some very interesting events on how privileged users interact with privileged systems. And there's going to be, events about if they are authorized or not, if they're running, what types of commands they're running on there, if they're moving laterally around the network. And there's also the ability to establish policy within these systems. So you'll also get events about policy violations. And then finally, over in governance, you're going to get events from your systems that are going to be most concerned with user lifecycle. And that is your SailPoints, your Savians, and Oracle and others as well. And they're going to be providing information about joiners, movers, and leavers, all of your entitlements. And you're going to see, you're going to get that metadata, those events about anything that has to do with users getting access to the network, losing access to the network, changing access. So all of these vendors are going to provide some type of analytics, and those analytics are going to be very useful within that same set of activities. But there's a need to go beyond that to get that 360-degree view of what the user is doing. And you're not going to get that until you bring all that data together and put it into that trust engine that we talked about. which is an example of that, which is our force point behavioral analytics. And an analytics capability similar to ours is going to be able to take these feeds and it's going to derive what we like to call identity analytics. And then those identity analytics are going to be applied to expert models. And those expert models are going to be linked to pretty much common areas associated with risky behaviors that link to, the types of metadata that you're getting. For example, you're going to see risky events around account management in our compromised user model. And that means that you're going to see anything that has to do with users manipulating accounts, whether it's in authorized fashion or an unauthorized fashion. Because of course, we want to get all events. We are concerned about what is authorized so that we can understand normal behavior. And then we're also looking at policy violations to understand what is abnormal behavior. You're also going to see things about cardinality, meaning for applications, meaning how often and how many different applications they're linking to at a time, if they're snooping around trying to see what accesses they have, things that are unusual. Another popular one is source country cardinality. And that particular model is going to be taking feeds from, for example, your single sign-ons and your authentications and logons to determine if that individual is logging in for multiple countries, right? Think about impossible travel, for example. If we've got events showing that David White is logged in from Russia, China, and Iran at the same time, that's going to be quite concerning. And those things kind of bubble up quite easy. We also, can move on to other types of events looking at the system administration, things that may be malicious. We can see the commands that are running. We can extract information from events about specific commands so that we can tell if they're malicious or not. And we can also look into other things as well, such as if accounts are being created out of cycle, outside of the governance process. So there's very exciting use cases that can be derived from all this. Next slide. I'm going to walk you through an example use case that kind of puts this all together, and you can feel free to build it all out. Essentially, what we're talking about is having this capability, such as this force point behavioral analytics, that's going to take this metadata that we talked about. It's going to enrich that data. It's going to apply it to our expert models, and it's going to provide a lot of interesting details about those events. And then it's going to provide scoring. And those scores are going to be based on ranges. And those ranges are going to be easily digestible numbers that can be shared with systems. So when we go back to this whole concept of zero trust, continuous monitoring, there's a need to be able to understand and perform this digital risk assessment on devices and people as they interact with data across the network, as I mentioned earlier. And to do that, what you're able to do now in this particular scenario is you're able to leverage a risk score or a confidence score, which is also referred to in some of the other texts. And that score can then drive access levels. So as you can see from left to right, you can see how a low score from, let's go from a range of 0 to 100, you can see how a specific user goes from a low score of 25 all the way to 95. And as you look at each action that happens on the timeline, you can see how that score elevates and how different ICAM systems through automation, another exciting topic that came up earlier in the panel, how that metadata is then used to feed automation, right? Each step of the way, adjusting access in ways that don't immediately prohibit that user from doing their job in the case there are false positives, but then ultimately will prevent a loss of data in the end. Leveraging the technologies that are available, using their policies and automation. So for example, when you look from left to right, you see that since a user has done some type of shadow IT, then when they interacted with a governance system, that governance system found that suspicious and then issued a reauthorization request to a system owner saying, okay, can you please double check that this person is actually supposed to be in that access group, or maybe you should revisit that. You'll also see as they go through, so for example, from left to right on this slide, you're seeing how you go from a pattern of behavior that's normal to one that's abnormal. And once again, in summary, we are able to then clamp down those protections. And what is this represented from a zero trust standpoint? It shows how we can take a user who's trusted, and then we can evaluate them and determine that they are untrusted. and then we can dynamically adjust their access. And that's in short. Dave, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yep, I think we're just right on the mark here. So, these are just key takeaways. To reiterate, the need for continuous evaluation of risk, in also in terms of how that scales beyond identity and the enterprise, and getting an understanding. And control is nothing, understanding is everything in today's cyber world. And then working in an ecosystem to bring and synthesize all this data up into a place of understanding. That singularity that the cyber threat hunters are looking for is going to be key. Any questions for us before we conclude?
All right, well, thank you so much, ForcePoint. This has been great. Really appreciate you taking the time and sharing this with us, and hope to have you guys back again soon.
All right, thank you for having us.
Thank you. Up next, we have our second panel of the day. I'm going to be moderating this one. So if our panelists, Tryphonia and Kelvin, could please come on camera and unmute yourselves. I'm going to have you both introduce yourselves to our audience real quick. Let's start with Kelvin first.
Hi, I'm Kelvin Brewer from ForgeRock. I am the senior manager of the public sector pre-sales team at ForgeRock. And I've been in the identity space for a long time, working with numerous different vendors, and especially with focus on trust and governance in that space.
Thank you. And Tryphonia.
Hey, good morning. My name's Tryphonia. I'm a security architect for the SBA, where I work on initiatives such as Zero Trust, and we're actually working on deploying a SOAR solution now.
Great. So for the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to talk about the future of Zero Trust. But first, before we do that, let's talk about the current status of Zero Trust in the federal government. What do you see are the current trends and anything that's happening within this space from your agency perspective? Let's start with Tryphonia on that.
Yeah, so it's been challenging to say the least. We've been, so first of all, getting everyone on the same page is a big undertaking, right? Doing all the communications and continuing to speak about what Zero Trust is, and then making sure that everyone is on the same page and we all understand what Zero Trust means to our agency. And then from there, kind of leveraging our current tools that we have and figuring out the foundations of Zero Trust, because in essence, Zero Trust is a set of design principles. It's a framework. And so figuring out how we can utilize what we already have and continuing to build upon that. So it's been interesting, to say the least.
And then Kelvin, what about you? Do you have a different perspective coming from industry as far as what you see in as the current status of Zero Trust?
Well, just to add to what Tryphonia is saying, the Zero Trust framework is a tremendous guidepost for us to try and get to. It's something that gives us a vision of what we need to be doing to really create security for the agencies, as well as help enable our users to be able to understand what they're getting access to and why they have that access, and so that they can fulfill whatever functions that they're trying to do for their responsibilities. And the interesting thing about that is, how does industry come together to work to create a realistic vision of what that really means? Because we have the framework, we have the vision, and it's being clarified all the time. OMB's recent document on Zero Trust was a further step in really defining where we need to go. But then we as industry need to work together to figure out, how do you implement that? How do you create realistic solutions around Zero Trust? And that's really where industry's at right now, is in cooperation with government. We're working to try and figure out, how do we work with other vendors in other different areas within the technology space to create a true Zero Trust solution.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. Let's pop up our first poll question of the day, which is, how important is Zero Trust to your agency's 2022 cybersecurity plans? And please rate those. as very important, all the way to you're not entirely sure about that. So that's the status of where we're at in government with zero trust right now. It sounds like there's forward motion, but communication and getting people to better understand the implications is a journey. So what do you feel is in store for zero trust in the future? Do you have insights into the near future, a long-term future? Where do you see this whole thing going throughout the federal government? And we'll start with Trifenia again.
Yeah, so this has been interesting because we continue to meet with different vendors. With the ATARC working group, we meet with a vendor two vendors every Friday to evaluate their zero trust solution. And then also at the SBA, we're constantly looking at how we're leveraging our current tools. And I'm excited for the future of this because right now, according to NIST 800-207, it talks about that trust algorithm, and we don't have that just yet. We don't have that that solution yet, and that's what we're trying to figure out and design at the SBA, and I think at other agencies as well, is how can we actually get to that point, and how can we get to that NIST 800, that pie in the sky visual of how we want to actually use that. What does that practically mean? And so really it's been a continuing conversation with other vendors and figuring out, okay, well, this vendor can do this piece of the zero trust pillar. Maybe this other vendor can do this piece, and then figuring out, okay, what's going to be that middleware, and maybe leveraging developers, maybe leveraging what is already out there. But it's been challenging to figure out what is going to be that trust algorithm piece that will hold, those policies so that we can dynamically assign those different, trust ratings to those different transactions that are going to be coming into it. So I'm excited to see what will transpire.
And for those who don't know what this trust algorithm is would you be able to break that down for us a little bit, explain what that means?
Yeah, so in NIST 800-207, there's a figure in there, and it talks about the different databases, which just means like different places of information that will be input into one section. So for example, you have your identity. The previous individuals that talked about identity. There's also data, there's also network, but speaking like to network, let's, for example, like a firewall or a router, or maybe your WAF, and that is sending logs into, you want it to send it to a trust algorithm, but that trust algorithm doesn't exist yet. So you want to send those logs into that trust algorithm. You want to have leadership or the security architects and basically everyone at the agency figure out, okay, what's our appetite for risk, and assign that to the policies within the trust algorithm. And then that trust algorithm can then act based on the policies that you have written to it. So it's this engine, it's the thing that will actually be, it will actually help zero trust come to fruition.
So would you say that for someone who, if they still don't really know where to start, would just reading the 800-207 be a really good place, having someone to be able to break it down and understand it? Or how would you?
It's a very dry document. Speaking candidly, Kelvin's smiling. It's very dry. It's very, it's a great document, and it will tell you what you need to know. But I would maybe, if someone is pretty new to zero trust, I would recommend reading maybe NSA's document about zero trust. That's kind of like a good high level, kind of get your feet wet, and then you can make your way to the NIST 800-207.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so
Mhm.
much.
Yeah.
And then Kelvin, turning it over to you, same, similar questions that I asked. What do you see as being in store for the future of zero trust within the government from your perspective at industry?
I was just talking about this idea of having something that actually is calculating the risk around zero trust with that algorithm. And, the future of that, in my opinion, and what we've been talking about in industry is making AI ML at artificial intelligence more of a center of what we're doing for all of the different pillars within zero trust. So when you think about what that really means, it means that you have a center core of an AI ML engine that is going to be calculating risk. No matter what it is that is trying to get access to the environment, or it has access to the environment and is trying to access different types of elements within the environment, that AI ML engine, the purpose of it is going to be to very quickly learn and determine the risk real time. And that's really where I think the important thing is when we're talking about identities, which is where ForgeRock really focuses on identities and IoT devices and things like that, and how they're getting access to an environment. When we're talking about that, it's a trust but verify model. It's really core to zero trust. And that means if the person's able to get in, if they are able to provide the necessary credentials, whatever that is, to get into the environment, then based on what they're getting access to and all of these different risk variables that we talk about, like impossible traveler and what IP they're coming in from, and is it a trusted device, and all these different variables, what should we trust that they can get access to based on the variables right now and their past history? So not only, imagine not only pulling in the information about the session today and what they're looking at, but also pulling in all the attributes that are around what they've gotten access to and how they've gotten access to it, how they've received that access, how they've used that access over time. And so that pulls in things like what's happening in a SIM and what we're getting out of logs, and also what's happening in governance and what we've done in certification campaigns and how they have received access through access requests and through automated provisioning. Pulling all of that information into a single place that can look at all these variables and quickly say, this person's risk index is now above the limit. And so that means we're only giving them access to these two resources versus the 10 resources they normally get access to. And maybe even let's send a quick message off to the Security Operations Center because maybe they need to do further research into this individual's login this time and see why the trend of what they're doing is different than what they normally do. And constantly be looking at those kind of variables to determine what the risk is of what the user is doing right now.
I have a quick question. So Kelvin, you touched on a SIM. I know we at the SBA and just kind of looking at the architecture of it, I've thought about leveraging a SIM as that trust algorithm, but then, then maybe pairing it with a SOAR solution to be able to act on it. Have you seen that in the industry, or have you seen anything like that for using the SIM as the trust algorithm?
I think more and more what's happening is we're getting a combination, and the SIMs have put in functionality. Most of them now have user event behavior analytics functionality.
Yeah.
And there's a mix of how it's implemented, and really it depends on where they're at today and where they're going. The SIMs that are adjusting to using artificial intelligence, machine learning type engines are moving forward with the model that I was just discussing, but there's still a lot out there that are rule-based. And when you think about what rule-based does, is that is dependent then on the individual organization to go in and define the fences for what would be anomalous behavior and what isn't. And though that is effective sometimes, but it can also leave a lot of holes in what you're considering as risk. And so whether or not a SIM could be a complete solution for identifying risk, I think there also still needs to be some other pieces to that, I know that a lot of the governance solutions out there are also coming in and building in AI/ML to things like the certification campaigns and the role and rule mining, so that what happens there is that risk is considered when you're doing those steps. And that some of that could be pulled from the SIM, but some of it is just resident to the governance solution, and same with the access side of things. And artificial intelligence machine learning engine that does immediate decisions on what the user is trying to get access to is going to be something that is got to be resident to the access management solution because of the time it takes to transfer data back and forth still.
Yeah.
And so if you've got a SIM feeding good data into the access management engine, it still needs to have a decision engine in the access management side that makes that decision really quickly. And so what I think where I think the market's going is that each solution, whether that's the SIM or the access management engine or the governance engine, whatever those are going to all have artificial intelligence pieces that are calculating risk and feeding it into making real-time decisions.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for answering that.
Trifinia mentioned something earlier about the vendors working together to provide solutions for this trust algorithm within Zero Trust. I guess maybe this is a question more for Kelvin, actually. What's your take on industry, different vendors, you know, being open and transparent to working together to be able to provide all of the solutions that the government agencies will need in order to enhance their Zero Trust within the government?
That's happening today. I think, you know, we like ForgeRock's CTO is working with the CTO offices with other groups that would be considered our competitors, but we're working together to figure out how to provide solutions that would help government, help commercial, help them to reach the goals that they're trying to reach to truly secure the individual. Because really the purpose is protect the organization and secure the individual at the same time. It's protecting both sides. And, you know, it's something that I saw exemplified when I was at an identity conference once, and there was two major players, Microsoft and Google, on the stage together. And what they said was, we're working together to eliminate the password. And we're both implementing the technology different ways, but we're working together to discover a way to do this. And then we're going to compete against each other, of course. But in the end, what we're trying to do is come up with a solution that is going to truly protect the individual by eliminating the password as a big attack vector of hackers. Well, you translate that to what we're doing today with Zero Trust, and that means that ForgeRock and our competitors, we need to work together to come up with solutions, which is by sitting on standards boards and talking to each other and figuring out how to define the different pieces of Zero Trust. But then we're all going to go back to our laboratories and figure out solutions so we can compete against each other. But hopefully those solutions end up bringing out a better solution for, you know, a solution that each vendor may come out with something different, but hopefully achieving the same goal.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. All right, let's pop up our second poll question, which shall read, what is the biggest obstacle that is standing in your way for fully implementing Zero Trust currently? And your options include technology, retail, manufacturing, financial services, or other. So please take a moment to answer that. And then speaking on challenges, in what ways do you think the federal Zero Trust can improve? So for instance, Trifinia, up top, you mentioned challenges, including like communication, coordination, as well as leveraging current tools. So do you want to dive into that a little deeper, or are there other things to keep in mind for improvement?
Yeah. Well, I like how you flipped it around, because I get that question a lot on what the biggest obstacles are, but we have not talked about the resolutions to those obstacles. And the first one that comes to mind is communication, both within the agency and then across the board. I know we're constantly trying to get better with the working groups. I think that helps a lot. So the flow of information continues to expand to all different parts of the different agencies, but also within the agencies, the way that it's set up, there's different program offices, and sometimes each program office can have its own IT or IS department. So it can be a little bit challenging. But I think a resolution to that is consistently meeting with other program offices, meeting with other, having the leadership continually meet. I know at the SBA, they're constantly trying to break down those walls within the program offices. And I know all of the CIOs, they meet on a regular basis. So I love hearing that, and I love seeing that they're continually doing that. I would say the vendors have done a really good job communicating back to the agencies on what they can and cannot do, especially with the working group. They're pretty clear on what pillar that they adhere to in Zero Trust. So I like that a lot. I saw that the biggest obstacle is technology, and I think everyone knows that, and that's why we're having these conversations, and that's why we're trying to get better at what we're doing, both on the agency side, telling, hey, this is what we need, and trying to be clear on those requirements. Sometimes that's a little bit tricky, but trying to be clear on those requirements, and then the industry just meeting those requirements. So I think we're on the right path. It's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah. And Kelvin, I'll pass the same question over to you. In what ways do you think that federal government can improve upon their Zero Trust, and what challenges, solutions do you see from the industry perspective?
I mean, first of all, I think watching what the agencies have done since the executive order came out in May has been tremendous. It's been a huge lift to try and meet the aggressive timeline that was set up in the executive order. And, you know, seeing some of the things that have come out from CISA and from OMB, I mean, it's amazing that the amount of clarity that we've received on where government wants to go with Zero Trust just in the last 8 months. I can't, you know, if you'd have asked me a year ago that we'd be where we're at today, I would say probably, I would have said no way, you know, not even possible. But it's been a huge evolution very quickly. And it looks like it's going to continue at a pretty fast pace with the timeline that's been set. And so from an industry perspective, we've already talked about how artificial intelligence plays a role. But the other piece that we see is really important in this is working together as industry solutions to create better orchestration so that it's not coding, it's not a lot of getting down and writing scripts to be able to define this, which has been a lot of what's happened in the past, and why it's been such a heavy lift to do any of this, and why it also costs a lot of money, especially in services dollars to systems integrators, is because you have these systems that have a good foundation, but they have a really heavy lift around coding to be able to get it implemented for the way that it needs to work for an individual agency. But where we need to go is providing more orchestration to the agencies so that they can do things like easily figure out what to do based on risk levels, how to act when that IoT device comes in, but it looks like it's been compromised, or what to do when someone's trying to authenticate. When do we do a step-up authentication? When do we ask for more information from the user because they're getting into something that's a higher risk that's a higher risk target? Well, then we need to make sure that they have authenticated properly and lift the amount of authentication required. But how do we know when to do that? A lot of that's been manual rules. A lot of it's been scripted. Now let's get into making it easier for the agencies to react and change as Zero Trust continues to evolve.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you both for sharing your insights. We only have a couple more minutes left, but I know there's been some great takeaways and things that people can bring back to their own agencies and share, or at least think about. With that, Trifinia, do you have any final thoughts? Anything you want to share with the audience before we close out?
Yeah, so what's been on my mind lately is whether to use a firewall in a Zero Trust. In a Zero Trust solution. So I challenge whoever's listening out there to think about their own agency and see if you can or want to architect a Zero Trust solution with or without a firewall. And so I'm just curious on what will come of that. But that's what's been in my head lately.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. And Kelvin, how about you?
I think from an industry perspective, what is on our minds is what can we do to effectively help the agencies meet the executive orders timeline? What are the roles that we can play, and how can we be effective solutions to the verticals that we're in? So ForgeRock, of course, focuses on identity and focuses on that vertical, so and that pillar. So what can we do to better assist the agencies in meeting the zero trust guidelines that have been established and the timeline, the aggressive timeline? And that's really what industry's looking for, is that direction on, what would be the biggest thing, what would be the biggest wins for the agencies to get to their zero trust goals.
Excellent. Well, thank you both. We're right at the 45-minute mark. I loved the opportunity to sit down and chat with you, and I look forward to doing it again sometime. So we are ready to hear from our next emerging technology talk. And this time it'll be Jeffrey Phelan, who is the public sector CTO at Rubrik. So Jeffrey, if you could please come on camera, there you are, and the floor is yours.
Great, thanks very much. Hopefully you guys can hear me, and it looks like you can see me. I'm going to share my screen out. I'm going to pop this up to presentation mode, and we're going to get going here. Well, thanks everybody. That was a great talk. I enjoyed the conversation there, and I think it's important. It's a good segue into what we're talking about here today, which is really around zero trust. But I want to talk a little bit more about what's going on at the infrastructure level, at the data layer. And as OMB's put their guidance out, this is an area that we're critically concerned about and that we're working with organizations on. And the challenge is that you've got adversaries these days that are using AI and ML techniques to effectively try to penetrate the infrastructure. And the reality is that many of our legacy systems, our three-tier architectures, are just a target-rich environment for adversaries to come in. And so the problem is that while we're moving towards zero trust and we're really working on improving the network security, perimeter, and so forth, we still have to be concerned about what's going on down at the data layer, at mission critical crown jewels, because as we know, an adversary is going to get, if they can get into the environment, they're going to start moving laterally. They're going to go for the identity systems, credential theft, and so forth to try to elevate privileges, exfiltrate data, steal data, and so forth. So part of what we want to be able to do is talk a little bit about what resiliency looks like in a zero trust model. So I'm going to build this out while I'm talking, because people are using lots and lots and lots of different words that sometimes mean different things. And part of what we try to do is educate our customers and agencies that we're working with. The first one here really is around air gap. And so the key is that organizations, if your backup infrastructure is accessible from the network, you don't have an air gap. If you can get there via NFS or SMB, you're going to get owned. It's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. And so the key there is that you've got to make sure that you're starting to look at physical air gaps or logical air gaps. And the challenge with a physical air gap is that really doesn't allow you to recover quickly. We're seeing a lot of vendors and a lot of legacy players saying, well, just, you should pay for 2, 3, 4 copies of your own data, move that offsite, stick it in Iron Mountain, put it in another physical site that's, where you've got that physical air gap. And the problem is that drawbridge may be down 16, 18 hours a day as they're moving data over there, and adversaries are going to come across that. So it's really important for you, if you want to be able to recover quickly, is to start looking at probably a logical air gap approach. Immutability is something I'll talk about real quickly. This is a word that's thrown around constantly, very similar to AI and ML, 7, 8 years ago in the cybersecurity space. This is a very property associated with the file system. Retention lock is a human in the loop, which is really good. It's like having sort of the nuclear football and extra keys there. So you want to make sure that you've got processes in place so that if someone who's coming in who appears to be an authenticated user, you can still verify that, particularly if they're going to try to make some changes to the infrastructure. And then data encryption in flight, at rest, north and south, east and west. This is table stakes. You've got to be able to do that. And remember, creating additional copies of your data and sticking it off in a commercial cloud or putting it off site doesn't mean that the data is immutable. It can't be changed. And by the way, you need to be able to recover. So as we go back into this this overview, where if an adversary can get through the security perimeter and hit back into the data, we really need to make sure we're emphasizing zero trust data management at the infrastructure level. Again, so the key here in the way we talk about it is trust nothing, suspect everything. You have to understand you have nation state actors targeting your environment. And so the key there is you have to understand how those nation state actors are going to begin to compromise your system. So you have to have mechanisms in place where you trust no user, you trust no service, you trust no port, protocol, or connection. You have to authenticate everything across the chain. And there are plenty of guidelines from NIST and other folks out there to help you do that. We've talked about encrypting of data. We're going to hammer that home again from a best practices perspective. All data at rest, all the data in flight, in between nodes and clusters, east and west, north and south, in and out of the cloud. And again, I'd encourage you, make sure you're working with your vendor partners and with your contractors and folks and get that guarantee that they can demonstrate to you that you've got an immutable file system. Not an immutable structure, but an immutable file system in terms of the process that you're doing there. One of the things that I wanted to lay out quickly is an architecture. So people talk a lot about zero trust. We've got good guidance. We typically focus is effectively a copy of your production, and you can see what's going on, who's accessing it, what are those behaviors and activities that may be suspicious. You want to be able to pump that back into your SIM tool, into the SOAR infrastructure, and so having an API first approach is really, really important. So one of the things I wanted to put up here is a quick stack and an overview, and you're going to see a repetition here as we blow through in our 7.5 minutes. You have to make sure that you're building countermeasures natively into your data protection, into your zero trust strategy at the infrastructure level. So you can see here what we've really tried to do is show you how you can lock down data, identity, users, policies and configurations, services, and the file system itself, and making sure you're going through a best practices checklist. How are you dealing with local user access? Do you have that human in the loop who's someone who comes in, tries to make changes, appears to be who they say they are, but you really need to make sure that you get on the phone, have that interaction, challenge that person, and do that. Folks, your backup infrastructure should not be a marketplace. This is not a service center. This is not around convenience. You have to provide an excellent service, but security and recoverability are your number one priorities. And so you need to make sure that you're using secure protocols. Again, you're not allowing access via NFS and SMB, which are easily compromised, and making sure that you understand how a bad actor is going to hit your infrastructure and take advantage of it. So as we're wrapping up here, I want to sort of walk through what we're really seeing across almost all of government. And it's this legacy system problem where organizations are struggling with adversaries that have custom exploits, nation state adversaries that are coming in, and they're able to come in and quickly compromise that hardware-based traditional infrastructure and creating what we would refer to really as an unrecoverable event. I've just recently saw some stats, I think, from Sophos, where only 7% of organizations that have been hit with ransomware have been able to recover all of their data. There isn't a single technology or policy or business decision that anyone's going to make with a 7% success rate. So it's really important there that you understand what you're dealing with. And so being able to collapse that infrastructure, reduce complexity, reduce costs is very, very good for you. So as we're wrapping up here, again, take advantage of the guidance that you get from NIST, CISA, CMMC, DHS. leverage your existing investments that you have, use that API approach so that you can get to the different cloud architectures, hybrid cloud, help with your current infrastructure. And I think this is a good way of showing how you can play and integrate with vendors. And they talked earlier in this panel, you really need to be able to make sure that you can, just push data around using JSON, XML, syslog. How do you integrate with SIM and logging, with your EDR and with your SOAR integrations? Your backup infrastructure from a data management perspective needs to be able to communicate and react and respond. And I'm going to close with this. This is an important area that we're seeing across government now. So beyond just the resilience is how do you begin to create a moving defense and operationalize the backup infrastructure? Once you start integrating with all of the different tools and you can get intel, you can now begin to actually create digital twins of any production system or enclave within minutes. And this is where working with your partners, where we're working with different vendors and we're able to put automated pen testing tools, malicious code detection, and embedding that into the system. And then you can begin to really launch automatic countermeasures. So the technology is there today, the investments people are already making. So we're excited about this, and hopefully we hit our time here. And I will stop sharing and turn this back over to the team.
Thank you, Jeffrey. That was great. We really appreciate it. Up next, we have another emerging technology talk, and this time we will hear from Paul Martini. Paul is the CEO, co-founder, and chief architect over at iBoss. Paul, over to you. Paul, FYI, you are on mute. But we can see your screen. We just can't hear you.
Can you hear me okay now?
Now we can, yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thanks. Hey, it's really good to be here with you guys. So I'm going to cover part of the SP 800-207 publication, which really is the core of the Zero Trust architecture and talks a lot about authentication and authorization, but as well as what they refer to as the policy enforcement point and the policy decision point. So this is the equivalent of what makes the decisions to allow users or different things to connect to each other in a secure way based off different policies that you have in place that grant dynamic access. A really quick background on myself. My name is Paul Martin. I'm the CTO and CEO of iBoss. I hold over 250 patents, both in networking and cybersecurity. I spent a lot of time in the network and security space. One thing to note for services like this, so if you think about what they refer to a lot as SASE or Secure Service Edge or Zero Trust Edge, the idea is that you have the equivalent of what the TSA does at airports. Actually, they use this exact example inside of the NIST document, where you have resources that are out there that are virtually everywhere. They're sitting in the cloud. They're sitting inside of your offices on a base. They're virtually everywhere, but you need to grant access to these resources in a secure way, based off user identity, role, as well as device posture, and a variety of other criteria. So what this provides for you is a way to look at the modern world where you have users and devices everywhere, and allow those users to access those applications directly from where they sit or from wherever they work. And services that are scalable, like iBoss, we're doing over 150 billion transactions per day through the service. So basically, as we look at these transactions, we're pulling out the content, looking at zip files, PDFs, applying CASB, malware defense, data loss prevention, pretty much anything you want to do to the content to grant or deny a connection from wherever someone works, or maybe it's an API that wants to talk to another resource, something like a Lambda function in AWS. You can inspect every single transaction and grant access to the resource while ensuring that your policies and your security in place, as well as all the logging and visibility. So every transaction generates a log event. You need to know what user it is, what group they're part of, as well as the device they're on, MAC address, machine name. All of that makes it into services like this, but also they get forwarded to your SIM as well. So your SIM and your SOC need access to visibility and information from these different log events that are being generated from transactions, but it's becoming more and more difficult as users are working from a variety of places, including their home. So typically, what you'll find, we see this as a three-legged stool for the zero trust architecture. You have something for identity. You heard from ForgeRock and others, but basically, who is this person and what group do they belong to? You're doing stuff on your endpoints, likely running an EDR or something similar to look to make sure the data is secure. And then ultimately, the data needs to move from one place to another. So what this secure service edge or what the ZTA or zero trust architecture in the NIST document referred to is as the policy enforcement point is allowing this policy enforcement point to grant or deny connections based off the user identity, based off the context, based off the device, and based off the historical security posture of that resource or that person requesting the application or data. And typically what we find, where we're sitting today, there was the big, obviously executive order that was just signed, and it was referring to the NIST 800-207. But typically what we have is a really legacy model today where you're backhauling data through a VPN in order to run a security stack through that on that data before hitting a destination. This model here in the middle, I think is a really nice model, and in between, where what you do is you offload the VPN traffic. Over 90% of the traffic gets offloaded, send it through a security service, a zero trust security service like IBOSS before hitting any destination. Now you're running CASB, malware defense, data loss prevention, and pretty much getting all the logging and visibility within this cloud service, immediately offloading the VPN and ensuring that every transaction is secure. So this makes it a lot better for end users, better productivity, better end user experience, and it's also great for the network and security teams. Eventually what happens is your users are connected to a zero trust edge, and that edge is able to access any application. So these are applications sitting on a base in an office, sitting in the public internet like Office 365. But the zero trust edge is what's granting access to these different applications. They're, in essence, all applications are private, and identity and user role is what's granting access through this edge to those resources. And as you look at a scenario and where this sort of fits in is you have devices everywhere. They're located in offices and working from home. All data goes through the service before hitting any destination. So this allows us to apply CASB, malware defense, data loss prevention. It also allows us to ensure that compliance is in place, filtering, logging, reporting for every single transaction. We use these cubes. These are software. Think of these as software proxies that are, we refer to them as software containerized gateways. So what this does is for every traffic flow going through the service, we completely isolate the traffic flow within these cubes so that the traffic is never mixed with any other organization or customer. So, as we're providing and enforcing rules, we want to make sure that all the policies are in place, but we don't want to mix that traffic with anyone else to ensure the traffic makes it to the right place, but it doesn't introduce unnecessary risk. It also has a very important implication when it comes to the NIST, the SP 800-207. In particular, if you look at the beginning part of the document where they're going over the basics for zero trust, what they refer to here, they show us a very simple diagram, and actually this document is extremely well written and it's very nuanced. The words are chosen very carefully, but at the very beginning, in the overview for zero trust, they show a very simple image and a simple concept because this is the foundation. If you're going to implement zero trust, anything you're going to do beyond this point, whether it's device posture checking, risk scoring, or anything else you want to do, fundamentally relies on this fundamental principle. If you can't meet this principle, everything else does fall apart. And what the document says is the PEP, which the PEP is the policy enforcement point. You can think of that as the gateway. The PEP applies a set of controls so that all traffic beyond the PEP has a common level of trust. So basically, any traffic in this implicit zone has a common level of trust. The PEP cannot apply additional policies beyond its location in the flow of traffic. So once you've crossed this gateway, there's nothing more you can do with the traffic when it's sitting at this point right in front of your applications. To allow the PEP to be as specific as possible, the implicit trust zone must be as small as possible. This last part of the statement of this sentence, this last part, a few words, they're not subtle. They're actually absolutely critical. What they're basically saying is this area here needs to be tightly controlled and only accessible through the PEP. So if you're thinking about, they use an analogy of an airport model where you cross through a TSA checkpoint. You have pilots and you have everybody crossing through that checkpoint, getting a common level of security. Once they're at the boarding gates, what you can infer about any person sitting at the boarding gates is that they've gone through the specific TSA policies. They all have gone through at least that level of security checks. In our case, it's not checking luggage. We're checking bags for the packages for ransomware, data loss prevention, CASB, logging, reporting. But you need to be able to control this implicit trust zone. So in this model, and iBoss is here on the left, you have users that are remote. They're connecting through the PEP, through this gateway. This is the untrusted zone here. The cubes represent the PEP, which makes the decisions of granting access. And because we're proxying here within these cubes, what we're doing is we're generating unique and dedicated IP space that only source traffic from this particular organization, and specifically only source traffic from this specific PEP or these specific PEPs that represent this organization, which means that to access any application in the cloud, whether it's private or public, the only way you can get to those applications and to get into this implicit trust zone is by going through the PEP. So you can't get any traffic here or to these applications unless you've gone through the specific policies. Containerization allows us to create unique and dedicated IP space for direct to cloud access, where all of these applications are completely locked and prevents traffic from anything other than you could only get there through this PEP. And actually in section 4.1, which is the network requirements for ZTA, out of the SP 800-207, enterprise resources should not be reachable without accessing a PEP. Enterprise resources do not accept arbitrary incoming connections from the internet. And that's basically what we're saying here. You can't go around and get, ironically, we do sometimes hear people think of enterprise resources as just resources in an office, but we really need to start, you really want to think about an enterprise resource as being anything, including Microsoft Office 365, it could be Zoom, it could be something in the office, but ultimately nothing should be accessible without going through this PEP. The PEP is the only one that grants this connection. It does so by understanding what the user identity is and applying the specific security policies that represent the policies for this specific organization, DLP, CASB, Malware Defense. So anyways, as you read this document, pay attention to the fundamental principles. We think that that's really important because if you go and you start implementing a process to—
Oh, we do have to wrap up soon. Sorry to interrupt.
Sounds good. Yeah. So, and I'm wrapping now. So, yeah, great to connect with you guys. We have a journey of how to get there, how to get here completely. If you guys have any questions, definitely reach out, and we'll be more than happy to answer them. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Up next, we have our next panel. We have Aaron Boyd from NextGov moderating. Aaron, over to you.
Thanks, Kirsten. Hello, everybody. My name is Aaron Boyd. I'm senior editor with NextGov, and I'll be moderating this next panel. But before we begin, I wanted to remind everyone that we are live today, and therefore we're able to take your questions. So be sure to submit those in the Q&A section as we go along. If I don't see any questions populating that box, I'm just going to keep going, asking my own, and blow right past any Q&A. So if you have questions, submit them as you think of them. Please also remember to answer the poll questions as we go through them to ensure that you get your CPE credits today. We have a great panel with us, including Andrea Simpson, Chief Information Security Officer for the Federal Communications Commission, Stephen Hernandez, Chief Information Security Officer at the U.S. Department of Education, Deirdre Bass, Defense Intelligence Agency Deputy Chief Information Security Officer and the Headquarters Deputy Division Chief for Cyber and Security within the U.S. Department of Defense, and Rob Rockwell, Director of Zero Trust Strategy at Palo Alto Networks. So we have quite a few experienced panelists here today and not a ton of time. So I'd like to just jump right in. I'm going to start asking questions, each of our panelists, as we start to go to you. If you could just let the audience know a little bit about who you are and what you do, 30 to 60 seconds, keep it quick, and we're gonna stick to content today. To get us started, Rob, I'm going to go to you for kind of a table setting. I want to get an idea of, from industry perspective, when we talk about zero trust, what we're talking about, and then I'm going to go to our federal CISOs and talk a little bit about how it's actually getting implemented in the wild, and how all these mandates are getting resolved. So Rob, let's start with you. Can you help us figure out, when we're talking about zero trust, baseline it for us a little bit? What are we talking about? Because if anybody says, I'm going to go buy zero trust, they don't really know what they're talking about, right? You can't just go buy it. So what are we talking about, Rob? You're on mute.
You would think 18 months of pandemic, I would have figured out the mute button by now, but no.
Nah, none of us, not a one of us.
The good news is my kids aren't here to ridicule me. Anyways, back to your question. Right now, Zero Trust is in a state of flux. People don't know what it is. Everyone's kind of racing to trying to figure out what exactly Zero Trust means. And so right now, what I'm seeing, and I work with, to answer your question also about like what I do, I work with a lot of customers on trying to define Zero Trust and try to help them implement something. And right now, what I typically see is one of two approaches. Approach number one, which is far more typical, I can't quantify it, but I can say it's a majority, is a bottoms up approach, because you typically associate maybe Zero Trust with, let's say, something like identity or microsegmentation. So you have a bottoms up approach and they say, hey, I just did Zero Trust in my network, or did some Zero Trust within some slither of my infrastructure. The second one, which is less common, but I think will become the majority moving forward if we have this conversation a year from now, is the tops down approach. The top down folks agree upon a framework and they say, here's how we're going to implement Zero Trust across the entire infrastructure because we have a broad plan to do that. So we're kind of in scramble mode right now, but in the future, that'll be displaced by something much more, by a North Star, basically.
So when you say top down, are you talking about leadership, or are we talking about having an architecture enterprise view of this? Like, so is it you have to start from that enterprise architecture and then work your way down? You can't just have individuals deploying Zero Trust and try to work that back up into the overarching architecture? Or are you just talking about leadership, where it just takes a certain amount of understanding and focus to get it done for an organization?
Yeah, so the answer is kind of both, because you need the leadership to say, hey, we're gonna consolidate on framework A or architecture, this type of architecture. What I'm seeing more and more is people just basically saying, you know what, Zero Trust is one use case. I don't trust anything. And then how does that use case apply across the entire infrastructure, whether it's endpoint, network, fill in the blank, how do you deploy that? But over time, again, that'll come from a tops down. And I think that'll standardize our approach. And I think a year from now, what we'll see is comparisons of different approaches. Hey, I used NIST, or I used, some other approach. How did those different approaches fare?
Yeah, excellent. I want to get to that framework discussion probably toward the end of this panel. Right now, I'd like to jump into our first poll question, just to get a sense of what's going on with the audience before we speak to our federal practitioners. So first poll, are you deploying a Zero Trust strategy right now? I'd love to hear from the audience about how they're doing that. So that poll question is up right now. While everybody's looking at that and they're answering, I'd like to actually talk to some of the people who we know are actually doing this. So Andrea, let's start with you. What's going on at FCC with regard to Zero Trust? What Rob was saying, does that grok with how you're looking at the rollout? What are you all doing there to meet these new mandates and get this, not brand new, but relatively new security structure up and going? And we're having some trouble with your audio.
There we go.
There
Can you hear me now? Yeah. So we're doing a combination of the two, kind of doing that bottoms up approach, top down approach. So from the bottoms up approach, it's kind of dealing with those projects that are currently in flight. They're already in progress, and kind of taking a pause on those projects and kind of going, okay, we've got this new effort going on. Where are you able to meet the requirements that are calling out for Zero Trust? Where can you meet it? Is it something that we can easily implement within the current work stream for that particular project? And if we can, then we're making those adjustments to kind of keep that on point, but then not having to go back and do any rework. And then from the top down, what we're looking at, again, because we don't want every instance going across our infrastructure doing their own interpretation of Zero Trust. So we're looking at it from a broad perspective and kind of going, okay, holistically, looking across the entire space, what does this look like? What does it mean for the FCC? So for my particular instance, one of the things we have to take into consideration is that we work with a lot of external entities. So we have to establish, what does that look like? How do we establish that trust? Or what do we do to validate that who we're in fact engaging with is who we really need to be engaging with. That's outside of our organization. So that's one of the things that's unique to that, or could be unique to the FCC. And then of course, then we have all of our internal, but then we also are dealing with a large legacy environment that we cannot immediately modernize. So we got to figure out, okay, so within that legacy environment, how is those trust relationships between the existing legacy and the new environments? How do we establish that? Can they do it? So that's where we're at right now. It's kind of doing that discovery, kind of figuring out, okay, what is it that we can do immediately? What are those quick, easy wins? Where is it that we establish that overarching structure? And then setting up the plan to kind of execute out on the overall intent of the zero trust architecture.
Yeah, really, there's a couple things that I wanted to pull out, but first one was you mentioned those ongoing projects and that you have to deal with some of that bottom up, right? Because there's already stuff going on. How much of that was specifically focused on zero trust? How many people were already using that buzzword, and how much of that was just ICAM stuff going on and other things that naturally will flow into a broader zero trust strategy?
So there were some things that were, hey, we're implementing this new system. We need to make sure we have it fully encrypted, in rest, in transit, and in use. We're utilizing multi-factor. So those things were already kind of, hey, you need to make sure that your project's able to do that. Now it's a matter of looking at it more in depth and kind of, again, understanding, okay, well, who are the actual users of these projects? Are they external? Are they internal? How are they using it? How are they interacting? Are they interacting with different systems? And kind of making sure that at the very least, the structure's in place. So this way, when we implement the zero trust across the board, it can easily integrate and we're not having to go back and do any rework. So that's really where we're at for those projects that are in flight.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to just get rid of all that progress, especially because it does naturally flow into the goal of a zero trust.
Correct.
Yeah,
absolutely.
When Andrew was talking about the outside stakeholders and how important it is to think of them as you're developing this, Stephen, it made me think of probably what's going on over at education, because I know you all have one of your big challenges is making sure that people accessing, for instance, student loan information are who they say they are. I also know you all, I think you put out recently a new regulation policy on enforcing that as well through your digital systems. So can you talk a bit about, one, what you are doing in education with regard to zero trust? And you can kind of start us off there, but how does that flow out to users that you don't necessarily have as much control over like you do your own employees, right? The people who are coming in from the outside.
Yeah, it's a great challenge opportunity for us. And there's been no shortage across the industry of impersonation attacks. In fact, right now, one of the big conversations we're having in the federal space is a wonderful NIST term called verifier impersonation resistant authenticators, a real fancy name for effectively saying phishing resistant authenticators, things that are very hard to phish. And this changes the way we think about authentication, because most of us are used to the term multi-factor authentication, which is much better than username and password or something similar. But what we're discovering is that, the bad folks out there, they've figured out ways that they can get through things like one-time tokens. If I'm using a one-time token, say an SMS or even an app on the phone that delivers a one-time token, well, I'll ask you for your username and your password and then your token as part of my attack on you. And so as we go forward, we're looking at how do we start to really evolve that authentication process and also that identity process. For us, we partner with 6,500 institutions of higher education. They're a big help in making sure that when a student signs the promissory note, there's some vetting there that says, yeah, this student, we have a high level of confidence. They are who they claim they are, and we match them up in the system. The second piece of that, though, is making sure that we're putting the authenticators in place that then maintain that relationship and make it so that, if a potential student or a student is phished, they're not able to give away the authenticator as easily as they were before. But we also have to recognize, our clientele extends from the extremely cyber savvy who would jump on this the minute we had it. They probably got their own UV key that they would add to our system if they could, all the way down to folks that are like, look, I just got my first cell phone and I'm just kind of figuring out technology. And for us, we have to figure out how do we build service models that can encompass all of that. And when we do make those trade-offs and decisions around, you know what, we have the tech advanced and the tech accessible user that has the cool authenticators, we probably need less concern about the association between the authentication and the identity. The other end, if we have a user that's like, hey, username and password is what I can do. Well, we may bring in some additional validation for identity. For example, well, what street did you live on 12 years ago? What car did you own in 1984, right? We'll bring in some of those additional factors to figure out, is this really the identity that we think we're working with?
And within that, how much are you relying on other agencies as well? A lot of identity proofing at the federal level uses, IRS data, census data, what have you, in order to authenticate people digitally. Is that something that you do at education? And if so, as you're grabbing that information, that's just more stuff you have to secure, right? So how are you thinking through all of that?
Yeah, it's great. And I mean, we have a lot of work that we do with the IRS, obviously, not just from income verification perspective, but also in streamlining that user experience. In a perfect world, when a citizen comes to the government, the federal government, and says, I want to do X, we should provide as seamless as a process as possible to get to X, whatever that desired outcome is. So we have some major initiatives to make sure that with our partners, especially folks in Social Security and IRS, et cetera, that we are bringing that together, where we have data that's accessible and meaningful and can improve that user experience while strengthening the security relationship. We're taking full advantage of it. And that's a really tricky and hard space because we absolutely must maintain legal authorities there. We cannot go out and ask for things that we don't have legal authority to have, but also we can't afford to leave things on the table where we do. And then working with the other agency, there's a lot of discussions around their authorities and whether we can do that or not. All brokered typically with the chief privacy officer in the mix to make sure that we're maintaining the integrity of the transaction while also moving the whole experience forward.
So I'm going to linger on this for just a second more, then we got to move on because we're taking up a lot of time with it. But you keep making me think of other things. Is there a space for a government-wide zero trust architecture that would enable some of that data sharing? Or is that just too broad and isn't going to work because agencies are too unique?
I think that we already have many of those pieces in place. The other piece is we have to maintain a citizen's expectation of privacy and frankly, independence. And we need to make sure that, as we build those systems that are more combined and federated, that citizens have the opportunity to choose their level of engagement and still get the services they need. I think that Zero Trust provides us with a great path forward into how we can start to provide those type of services. We look at things like login.gov. That is an incredible first step forward of saying, for citizen services, login.gov should probably be your first step. And then you can decide, do you want one identity? Do you want 50? That will change who and what services you get action to. But I think that we're starting to go down the path, and identity is the right place to start, and authentication is the right place to start. And we have that with login.gov. I think as we go forward federal wide, we're going to see greater adoption of shared services like login.gov, and I think that's going to move that conversation forward.
Yeah, you can't have any kind of trust without identity, right? It's all got to start there, I think. So Deirdre, I want to go over to you. One of the things that's been said a couple of times today is talking about the ease for the user, right? And I think it'd be interesting to talk to you about this because DoD has such a diverse user base. Every kind of person in the U.S., works at the DoD. So this idea, you said the enemy knows everything or the enemy knows the system. My big thing that I try to push is the corollary to that should be the user knows nothing. You should be able to know nothing about cybersecurity, click every link in your email. I know that's not the world we live in, but as we move towards zero trust, can we get closer to that? I mean, can we get to a place where the user doesn't have to have any security knowledge or interact with the security ecosystem in order to remain secure?
Definitely. Can you hear me? All right. Excellent. That's actually exactly what we are trying to get to. It's going to be It's going to be a journey. It's going to be a process. We're trying to streamline as much as we can, where we automate as much as we can and take the user decision making out of it. Of course, we want to make sure that we have savvy users. That comes with, of course, customer awareness. That comes with just customer training. You definitely want to make sure that you have that in place. But yeah, where we can implement technologies, where we can implement automation that takes that decision factor away from the user, Zero Trust definitely gets us along that path.
Excellent. In the same vein, I wanted to hit an audience question, and we'll start with you, Deirdre. So this person asks, good morning all. Very, they start off nice. What is the response on the ground at your agencies when Zero Trust is being proposed or implemented? And honestly, I like this question for a number of reasons, if not mostly because Zero Trust, I think, has jumped the buzzword shark. It kind of started there already. So when people hear this, do they go, it's another mandate, it's another buzzword, it's another cybersecurity system that I'm not going to understand? Or are they like, Zero Trust, that sounds, I've heard stuff about this before. What's the sense you get when you talk to people and tell them that this is coming? Deirdre, let's start with you on that.
Oh, absolutely. It really has been a education campaign, and just stealing a page from Andrea, we took that top-down approach, making sure that we had those discussions with our key stakeholders, letting them know, like you just said, you know what? It's not one tool that you can buy for Zero Trust. This is something that's going to be across the board, across users, devices, networks. It's a fundamental shift. While we have some things already in place, we're having to go in with a different mindset from the perspective of, not trusting anything, assuming, almost assuming that something is inside the wire, but making sure that they can't move laterally, making sure that they can't do anything if they do get in. Sometimes people, they thought Zero Trust, that is just so rude, but again, there are those security Nazis go again, and security people go again, just being paranoid. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, they're seeing it play out in real world, and they're having a greater appreciation for cybersecurity. So just really doing that education with our stakeholders, with our users, and we kind of transition more from a stick approach to a carrot approach, really letting them know what's in it for them, how this is going to streamline some things, how this is going to protect their data, get the right people, the right accesses at the right time. Just kind of really showing people what's in it for them. And that's been a true advocate in helping us get the message out.
Yeah, I imagine particularly for more your tech savvy people at DoD, I know flattening the network at DoD has been one of the grails for maybe the last decade. You've really been trying to get that so people who are supposed to be in the network can move laterally. But obviously you can't have that if you don't have a security structure that it allows people to do that without compromising, right? I wanted to get everybody's view on this. We've got about 8 minutes left here, so I want to do this the next 3 to 5 minutes, and then we'll talk a little bit about frameworks. So Andrea, let's go to you, back to you again. What's been the sense at FCC about, as you talk about these things, both with the staff there, and also, as you mentioned off the top, collaborating with outside stakeholders? Are there concerns? Are people understanding what you're trying to do, or is it a lot of fun?
So right now at the FCC, it's more education, as Deidre kind of indicated, because it's more so for us, it's more of a cultural shift in terms of how we do business and understanding, well, we do business, using these 10 steps. Well, those 10 steps don't fit well within this Zero Trust architecture, right? So it's really so that's more what I've been kind of teeing off to the stakeholders and kind of going, hey, I really need you to look at this process, really break down what it is that you're doing and the reasons why you're doing it, because that's going to drive how we need to secure what you're doing and the data that's being accessed. So that's really where I'm at in terms of that conversation with our stakeholders is really getting them to understand that because you did something 10, 15, 20 years ago, that the way and method you're doing it does not work or won't work well for where we're trying to go. So that's where I'm at right now. It's really kind of going, hey, we really need to look at this from a business perspective because security needs to be about enabling that business, not hindering it. And zero trust needs to be, again, to enable it. And before I can do that or implement those technologies and those rule sets, we really need to understand, okay, what is it that you're doing? Why are you doing it? What's the impact if something doesn't happen? This way we're making sure we're putting the right constructs in place.
So how are you doing that? Is that conversations with people? Are you asking everyone to submit one sheets, with drawings of their architecture? What's it look like?
Right now it's like these one-off conversations, again, in our like standard operation meetings or different ongoing efforts. It's those general conversations. One of the things that I've been doing recently is that when we're having various necessary incidents, but issues that come up with the infrastructure, I take that opportunity to go, hey, we need to look at these things because here's how it's going to fit into our future for zero trust architecture. So I'm taking advantage of the general ongoing cadence that's going on within the infrastructure and kind of putting those seeds into everybody's mindset. This way they start thinking along those lines. So when we get into the nitty gritty of truly delving out the plan, everyone's at least been thinking about it and they can kind of wrap okay, I get where you're trying to go. I understand where we're heading. All right, here's the approach that we can take.
Yeah, I love the way you talk about this in general, just because it's very demystifying, right? Like it's the way you're talking about, like I could see how you can get from A to B and actually do this, which is not always the case when we talk about these things. But you also are helping me out because you flowed right back to the frameworks conversation, right? As people are doing things, you talked about what they were doing 10, 15 years ago. Those things aren't bad or wrong necessarily. Some of them might be today, but how do those things get plugged back into the new infrastructure? Rob, you also mentioned this off the top, so I want to go back to you for a second. When we talk about infrastructures or frameworks, I know Palo Alto has one, NIST has one that Stephen mentioned before. There's all kinds of frameworks out there. Do we need standardization in this field? Do we have to get to a point where we've got one framework or everything's just going to be too much noise? Or is this something where we can work with multiple frameworks that will apply to different sectors, health IT versus education versus national security?
So I think having the framework debate is actually healthy competition. Let's see what works. It's a bit, it's a bit like dating, right? You're going to date around, see what works, and eventually you'll find somebody that you like. The one thing I would caution, and this is coming from a vendor, is that what's really hurting a lot of organizations is the fact that a lot of frameworks are very vendor centric. So, hey, if you just get my endpoint stuff, you're done with zero trust. And we all know that's kind of silly. So you have to look for something, you just have to look for I think the right requirements. Is it broad? Does it cover everything? Is it not just, you do microsegmentation and you're done? No, that's not going to be the case. Does it cover, some of the emerging things like IoT and certainly obviously cloud, things like that? Does it take into account, how a SOC needs to think about zero trust? Because they're basically there to double check your trust decisions. Hey, my endpoint product did X or trusted X. That was the wrong decision. We need to go back and rethink that because we have more data. So these are the kinds of things that a framework should look at. So I think at this point, it's more about judging the framework based on the correct set of parameters. And then, like I said earlier, a year from now or whatever, we'll have some different experiences under the belt. And again, this is healthy competition to see what's going to work. So for example, we put our framework together. One of the things I discovered is IoT is a big deal with a lot of companies. With other companies, they don't care about it at all for obvious reasons. It's not just part of what they do. So you have to look at these things. So it's a learning process. Vendors are learning, framework creators are learning, and obviously, as we've seen here, the security teams are learning as well.
Yeah, almost like we need a checklist framework for checking the frameworks, right? Like, so NIST should put out like here's a framework for frameworks. Let's get that last CPE question up. Just asking the audience which zero trust frameworks they're using as they start implementing this. And as that question comes up and people are answering, Stephen, I wanted to go back to you. As a practitioner, and I know you also sit on the CIO, the CISO council, so you see what's going on around government quite a bit as well. How do you frame the framework discussion? Do you tell everybody go to NIST because they're one of us, or how are you telling people to consider this?
Yeah, well, so OMB Circular A130 mandates that we use NIST as the primary framework because it's part of the 800 series. So all departments and agencies are going to be looking to 800-207 first. I think that what's important, though, is that we start overlaying that with our mission and our business areas, we then start to see intersections with various other frameworks that may resonate more with us, and they become secondary and tertiary frameworks. Where this all comes together is really when we start buying technology or we start buying services. That's where we start to see 207 as kind of the floor, and then we build on top of it the capabilities and the spaces that are going to deliver the most value for that mission space. And I think ultimately what we're going to see is, I don't think that the ZTA model in terms of NIST or the federal government is going to be more prescriptive than what we see right now. I think as a framework and as an architecture, that's the key to the architecture, we're at the right space, because that's going to give the agencies and departments the flexibility to bring in and tailor those right solutions for their missions.
Excellent. And unfortunately, we are out of time, but I do want to note, Rupesh, you're just a little too late on getting your question there because you're out of time, but there's a fantastic question there. I'm just going to pop it up here. Since all roads stop at ATO, how are we envisioning the zero trust change to the ATO process, if at all? Andrea already jumped in and started answering that one. Thank you for that. If our other panelists want to jump in there, I think that's a very interesting framing, and I wish we had more time to talk about it. Next time we're on a panel all together, we can break that down. But for now, thank you all so much for joining us, and the audience out there for your engagement as well. Kirsten, back to you.
Thank you so much, Aaron and panelists. Excellent discussion. Next up, we have an emerging technology talk. First, we'll be hearing from Ray Quintebel. Ray is the federal sales engineer over at Menlo Security. So that'll be our first one. Ray, over to you, sir.
Got to take myself off mute there. Always helps. So thank you for the time today. We're going to spend a few minutes talking about Menlo Security and what we do and how we do it. And so zero trust is one of these buzzwords, I suppose, and we have a zero trust approach towards web browsing. We're actually deployed widely in the DoD. We recently won a deal with DISA, and we're actually deployed out to millions of DoD users, as we speak right now. So they're enjoying our protections for their web browsing and our zero trust model relative to web. So just a couple of thoughts about the threats that are out there today. These are the big ones that people know about, and they all have kind of one thing in common: is they're either born from email or from the web. Right? I think that most of us understand that, in today's environment, like the internet is the place where viruses come from, whether it's on files or documents or malicious downloads, ransomware, etc. It's usually coming in on web or email. And we have a zero trust approach to web browsing that really reduces your attack surface area significantly when it comes to your users' exposure to the bad stuff that's out there on the web, whether it's coming in on email or whether it's just going to a particular website or downloading a document, etc. And you can see these numbers are going up, right? Phishing was really accelerated with COVID. When everyone's all of a sudden working at home and communicating on, like we are right now, on Zoom. Just the surface area there just increased dramatically. So, we saw a dramatic rise in phishing. And obviously ransomware, we had this big Colonial pipeline. I couldn't get gas myself for a few days out here on the East. You don't want to be that agency that ends up in the news, because you've been attacked with ransomware and they've encrypted a bunch of your systems. So we're here to help you avoid those kind of activities. So at the end of the day, we've got this big DoD contract. It's a great opportunity for us to deploy across the DoD mission partners as we are right now. I think we won that deal last year, and we're kind of in the process of rolling it out to millions of users, and it's going quite well. We're in the process of doing FedRAMP. It's a very complicated process. We do expect to be on the marketplace by the end of the calendar year, so we're just turning the corner on that whole procedure. A couple of notes about our product itself. So let me get rid of this thing here. We are a multi-tenant elastic cloud. So what that means is that we're built in AWS. So as our user community kind of rises and falls throughout the day, we just scale horizontally. We just build out containers for those individual users, and if it's 10,000 more users next hour, we just kind of scale horizontally in AWS. So we are truly an elastic platform. And that's great, especially for situations where you have a large agency, whether it's new to the service, or you just have everybody coming in at a certain time of day and getting on their computers and opening up browsers. We can just scale elastically within this global platform, and it's really not very difficult for us to do. So that's great for you as an end user or an IT team. You don't have to worry about, do I have the capacity to handle this workload? We also can deploy quite rapidly. We've turned on some mission partners in the DoD space, within just a few days to a week. It's very easy to build a new tenant and provide the tools necessary. Within the DoD, they typically will push this out with a GPO. So it's relatively easy to push out to endpoints. You don't have to have any special software. There's no hardware. So from a deployment perspective and maintenance, et cetera, it's quite easy once you get once you've pushed out the configuration to the endpoints and you've got the platform set up. It's kind of set and forget, which is a nice thing about the platform. It does provide you flexibility as far as your policy and a high level of security, which we'll talk about, but it's also quite easy to deploy. And also we're in the enterprise space as well. We do like to talk about some of the banks have deployed menless security, and that's really just because they have so much to lose, right? For obvious reasons, they are very security conscious, much like the DoD. And with our browser isolation and what it brings to the table from a security perspective, I think that's really why they chose us. So I've got about 2 or 3 minutes left, so I'm just going to go into architecture and talk about, what is Menlo, what does isolation mean, and why is it so secure? So this is a bit of an eye chart, but I'm going to walk you through kind of what this actually does. So if you're over here on the left, you're a user, and you open up your browser and you type a URL. In this case, we're kind of showing like a bank card URL, or maybe it's CNN or wherever you're going. That request will come up to the Menlo cloud. In that cloud, we'll actually spin up what we call a surrogate browser. So this is a browser that's in a disposable virtual container in AWS. We just assigned this user's browser to their own DVC, so they have their own surrogate browser up in the cloud. And that surrogate browser will go fetch the web page that this user is trying to get to, right? So maybe it's CNN in this case. So we'll get back the HTML from CNN, and especially a site like CNN is going to have tons of JavaScript. Probably 100 different scripts are going to get downloaded, when you open up the homepage for CNN. Existing tools, a lot of secure web gateways will look at those objects and say, is this good or bad? Should I let this through or not? And it's kind of based on known bad antivirus signatures. If you detect something that's malicious, you're obviously going to block it. But if it doesn't match an antivirus signature, then you let it on through. And we don't think that's zero trust. So what we do instead of that game of trying to determine whether something's good or bad is we just don't send it to you in the first place. What we do up in the cloud is we assemble the page and we look at the document object model, some kind of back-end web stuff. And then we render the page down to your endpoint. So you can see here the render is on this side of the bit gap. And the fetch and the execute of all that content is kind of on the cloud side, right? So your endpoint browser is no longer fetching all that stuff straight from the internet, you're only getting traffic from Menlo Security, and it's really just a rendered version of the page. So it's going to look like CNN, it's going to act like CNN, you're going to have the ads and the clickbait and all the stuff that you're used to, but you're not actually getting any code from the rest of the internet. And that's called remote browser isolation. And that's why it's so secure, because we're really just not sending any of those scripts that you would normally associate with, a site like CNN or any other risky site out on the web. So that's why it's so secure. That's why the DoD and these banks and other enterprises have chosen Menlo Security to provide this zero trust approach to web browsing. And oh, by the way, it's also a secure web gateway. So we start talking about, what else can the platform do? It's also a URL filter. We can handle files and documents. We can control bandwidth. We can do DLP. We can do CASB. And also we're rolling out our private access, which takes this concept of isolation and provides access to private applications in kind of the same way. So whether it's a user within your agency or another agency or a third party, we can allow you to get in and out of private apps through a similar sort of architecture and keep those users off the VPN. So that's another product that we're excited about. We don't have time to talk about that today, but it's something that we're actively pursuing with some mission partners, the DoD and some other enterprises as well. So here is our contact information. We are going to be presenting to the larger ATARC group in depth in the next weeks or months. But we appreciate the time today, and feel free to reach out to us. We have a great product. It's already in use in the government, and yeah, we hope to hear from you.
Thank you, Ray. We appreciate it. Up next, we have another emerging technology talk, this time from Eric Koslow. Eric is the Federal Field CTO over at Contrast Security. And Eric, we look forward to hearing from you. We'll just give him a minute to boot up his presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming today. My name is Eric Koslow. I'm the Federal Field CTO for Contrast Security. And today I want to talk about application security in terms of zero trust for application workloads. And the way that I want to base this conversation is to focus on the zero trust maturity model that was published in CISA's guidance called Zero Trust Maturity Model, that has a section in it called Pillar Number 4 that deals specifically with application workloads. And what they've done is to break down application workloads into access authorization, threat protection, accessibility, application security, visibility and analytics capability, and automation and orchestration capability. And they've put each of these into an element called traditional, advanced, and optimal based on the level of need and criticality that your application has, so you can figure out if you want the traditional aspect or if you want to go up towards the advanced and optimal, which sometimes is actually less work because you can focus on using automation and take advantage of a lot of tools that can actually do a lot of the work for you, letting you either engage existing applications much better or scale to more teams faster. Now, the way that I want to deal with this is I have a bingo case right next to me, and I actually want to roll this bingo item. I want to roll this. We'll pick out a little tile, and we'll ignore what the tile says, and we'll pick out any item in the bingo matrix and just talk about how contrast pertains to that particular application security standard, because bingo is a fun game, and it's a lot more interesting to look at. But the first thing that I want to do before we get into the games is to talk about what Contrast does. What is it that we actually do? Contrast is focused on application security, securing the application workloads, and we do that in a number of ways. One of which is we create a software bill of materials, or SBOM, that tells you specifically what is in every piece of software that you use that we engage. The reason you'd want to do that is now you understand where you have vulnerabilities, or CVEs, in your software supply chain, so that you can focus on understanding which vulnerabilities affect your applications. We also offer custom application vulnerability detection in the form of static analysis that works on your custom code, as well as how your custom code interacts with your libraries. And this is a tool that can be used whether your developers are in-house or whether you've outsourced them. We also have a capability called Contrast Assess, which is an integrated analyzer that can find custom code vulnerabilities that are unique to your application. They're not CVEs yet because these vulnerabilities are unique to you. And we can find those with an extreme level of accuracy, which means a lot less false positive back and forth in terms of discussion. But no one is perfect, and no one has all the time in the world. So we also have a capability called runtime protection, which can defend running applications from exploitation, so that if you need to ship, if you have deadlines that you have to hit, or you need to understand how these vulnerabilities are being engaged by any attackers in the wild, you can defend those applications against exploitation, you can stop the attacks, and you can schedule your fixes and plan ahead. Now, the first thing that I want to do in terms of looking at the vulnerabilities is to focus on application security. So application security has three functions. You can be on the traditional side, which is your team does the bulk of the work. You constantly have to scan, you have to engage every team. The burden is placed on you or a central application security team that always feels like a bottleneck. Maybe they have a tool, but they're the primary users of the tool and they have difficulty scaling to meet the demand. Well, what Contrast can do is to help you go to the advanced and optimal phases where you have an automated tool that can engage your applications to look at security vulnerabilities, pick out where the applications are vulnerable, tell you how they're vulnerable, and guide you in terms of what you need to do to fix those vulnerabilities. So in order to go from advanced to optimal, one of the things that you would do is you would place the automated contrast detection agents in the application, make that application assess itself with a high level of accuracy, and detect any vulnerabilities in that application. Now, the way that it would look when you do this at scale in an organization is you would receive a dashboard that you can look at because you want to oversee the entire org or you want to oversee your department. So you get a score that says about how well are you doing in application security. In this case, we have about a B score, which means that we're pretty good, but we still have some room for improvement. This gives me my organizational view, but there's also a role of, are people actually following the standard, or are they really just waiting until the end, and that's the reason that I haven't found things? So in the bottom right of this screenshot in adoption, you see the question of, are people actually doing my security control? Because if they're not, you know that you're going to have problems and delays at the end when all of a sudden people realize that they need to engage security because they haven't been doing it all along. But an organizational view isn't always what you need. Oftentimes you need the ability to drill down into individual teams and departments. So what Contrast gives in this regard is the ability to look across an organization at individual applications and see how is each team doing. And if you want to filter by group, by department, by tag, by criteria, you're welcome to do that and gain an understanding of how these applications are doing in terms of their security. A blank would mean that they're not following guidance, and a red would mean that that team has a little room for improvement. Now, another item that we deal with is the role of threat protection, which is the engagement of application security controls. And what Contrast can do in this regard is help you automate the integration of security detection techniques into an application to flag new vulnerabilities as they're introduced. And the best part is you can automate a lot of this. If you hook into a release cycle or if you hook into the deployment model, you will always engage every team where your tool is placed. You can detect any new vulnerabilities that come in. And if you do that in a testing phase, you can use Contrast Assess to pick out the test vulnerabilities. And if you need to defend your application in production, you can use Contrast Protect in production to gain security detection time in terms of remediation of vulnerabilities so that you can plan ahead and schedule. The CI/CD is a great opportunity to engage applications in a way that can't be bypassed. So with that, we're happy to continue any discussion that you have. We want to continue this conversation. Please feel absolutely free to reach out to either myself or John Nesbitt. We'd love to talk with you about Zero Trust and how Contrast can help you with this and more application security controls. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And then next, we're going to have our second panel of the day. This one I'll be moderating as well. If our panelists, Robert and Jeff, could please come on camera, and you can go ahead and unmute yourselves. And I'll have each of you briefly introduce yourselves to our audience, as well as share anything you'd like to up top. We'll start with Robert, please.
I mean, I don't have any particular agenda coming on here, so no. I mean, other than to introduce myself, my name is Robert Wood. I'm the CISO over at Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services.
Great, thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Kirsten. Robert, good to meet you.
Likewise.
I'm not in one of the agencies. I'm the CEO of a company called Venafi, and I think it'd probably be appropriate if I maybe spend a minute and talked about kind of where Venafi fits in the world. Let me just give you context, and this will explain where we fit. The way the world is constructed today, there's two actors on a network: people and machines. And people use usernames and passwords to identify themselves to machines. And the machines have to identify themselves to each other. And they don't use usernames and passwords, they use machine identities. And so if you know what Okta is for managing human identities or passwords, think of us as Okta for machine identities. And the reason this is important is that the number of machines, and machines are broadly defined now by Gartner, which has created this category called machine identity management, of which we invented actually. I invented about 11 years ago. Gartner just recently published some papers on this. Machines are basically software, and because everything can be virtualized. And the number of machines is going through the roof, as we know. The number of people is relatively flat. The number of attacks that use machine identities is going up radically. And the reality is identity security has become identity because of the zero trust environment we're in. And the reason we're in this zero trust environment is that machines are now everywhere. They're not behind a firewall. So cybersecurity really is about denying access to those that you don't want to have access to a resource or data, and allowing access to those that you do want to have access to that resource or data. And it all is now based on identity. So it's identity of humans and it's identity of machines. And so many attacks now are just machines attacking other machines. This becomes really important. We're the world's leading supplier of open source software. 3,500 organizations worldwide use our technology. Many federal agencies and departments use it. We've got the largest ecosystem, thousands of integrations with everything that needs, all machine types that need to be integrated. We're common criteria certified, FIPS compliant, and we're on a mission is to make the world a better place by securing the machines that are having more and more influence on us. And that all starts with making sure identities are managed and protected.
Excellent, thank
Kirsten,
you.
that gives you a few things to talk about.
Certainly, it's nice to meet you both, and thank you, Jeff, for that background. So what we will be talking about today is securing the cloud through zero trust, and we'll go ahead and put up our first poll question, which has to do with the question I'm going to ask next. So this poll question will read, should be up momentarily. In your opinion, how important is zero trust to securing the cloud? So let's get a consensus on that. But that being said, Robert, I'll turn it over to you first. Could you please speak to in what ways zero trust security has helped secure the cloud?
Sure. So, I mean, I should say I don't love this. I don't love this question. I think it's very broad. Yeah, I mean, the answers to the poll show, of course, it's important. So all of the foundational principles that go into zero trust are awesome things and apply across, like, regardless of the deployment environment, the cloud, on-prem, hybrid environment, purely cloud native, SaaS, PaaS, whatever you're sort of operating in, like those sort of principles transcended into the environment, like they help. Of course, they're absolutely helpful. So
And I think you can apply it to like in all of the dimensions, whether it's, the stuff centered around access control, least permissions, like isolated microsegmentation, all of that stuff is important. So, I mean, you could take this question in 1,000 different ways, but we definitely don't have time for that.
Yeah, and Jeff, so maybe at a high level, could you please explain to our audience who doesn't understand, what does the cloud have to do when it comes to security and zero trust? Where do these two things meet?
So just the word zero trust, or the phrase zero trust, I think to a certain extent kind of misleads, because how can you have zero trust and still transact anything? And the guy that actually coined this phrase from Forrester was John Kindervag, who was an analyst there. And I always kind of ask him, well, why you use this concept zero trust? Essentially means there's no perimeter. And applications, data that used to be behind a firewall are now spread out and they're everywhere, which means that you don't have a firewall at which to protect. And so what that means is what you used to have to do, what you have to do to protect is you have to protect without a firewall. And that means that you've got to do what Robert talked about, but you got to do it in hundreds of places. Today, somebody might say, well, I have some things running at AWS, but not really true. Everybody finds they're in just about every cloud. Everybody finds there's things running on laptops everywhere. Everybody finds that they still have things in the data center, and all these things communicate together. No more firewall at which to have firewall rules that say this can access behind the firewall and this can't. So what that means is there's essentially zero trust in the environment. And you've got to, at every transaction, and it's not static, it's highly dynamic for every transaction, you've got to make sure that the entity or the person that are in the transaction are trusted. So we go from zero trust, meaning there's no firewall, to you've got to make sure everything is trusted, because anything can connect to anything. And it's a really interesting world to try and secure, because there's just so many points that attacks can come from. So the attack surface has just exploded recently.
Thank you. And then Robert, so at a high level, I know we don't have time to get into the weeds for this, but the question would be, the process for securing the cloud through zero trust. What are some of the top, things to consider as folks within their own various different agencies try to go about doing so?
I mean, that's hard to answer, because I think it depends. You're going to hear every which like technology partner, vendor solution, like their thing is the thing that's going to solve your problems. And I think like they're all part of the picture, right? They're all a piece of the puzzle, and that's important and helpful. But I mean, who's to say what is the most important thing? Like, is identity more important than networking? I don't know. It depends on like the relative state of those things in your environment, I think anyways. And so, I think where I would start is actually, if you zoom back out from, get away from the solutions and the tactics and all of that stuff, and zoom back out and take like the maturity model that CISA put out. Amazingly valuable resource. Sort of builds off of the NIST and OMB guidance. That's awesome. And so like you have these different pillars of the zero trust framework, and just figuring out like where you stand along these journeys, because you could say like, yes, I do a thing, but maybe you're not doing it all that well. Maybe you're just kind of scratching the surface, and you need to really level up in that particular area. So I think it's important to whether you're operating in a like fully cloud native, hybrid, or brick and mortar sort of environment, or all of the above, depending on your size as an agency or organization, it's important to understand like where you are through some kind of a framework and metrics and all of that, so you can understand where you need to go. Because if you jump like straight to solutions, I mean, you're just going to end up with a hodgepodge of things, and that's not like that is not going to get you where you want to go. It'll probably help, but it will definitely not be the most efficient or effective way to spend those resources.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And Jeff, I'll turn the similar question over to you. The process of securing cloud through Zero Trust, where would you say folks should start, or what has your experience been from the industry side?
You got to prioritize where the highest risk in your environment is. And just like Robert said, in some places they have zero protection, or they're doing nothing in some parts of their network or some parts of their domain. You can't even call it a network anymore because everything's on the network. So they're just not doing certain things, and they've got to, and that's the biggest risk, and they got to take down the biggest risks first. The interesting thing about risk is that it's, impact and probability, and both those get pretty subjective pretty fast. And so it all comes back to using a framework that helps you decide what those are. But the other thing we find, and we work very closely with NIST, we've written a number of papers that have been published and become part of the NIST document set. The frameworks really lag behind the attacks. And so what we see a lot, the world has sped up so much that what used to work sort of, where you'd have frameworks and people updating them, I mean, frameworks are nice, but then you have to think about, okay, so where are the attacks really happening now if you want to secure it? Frameworks are very valuable if you want to comply. And a lot of people default to a position where they say, well, I just want to make sure I'm compliant with a framework, so I've done the best job I can, and I'll just defend that because I use this framework. And when it comes to really protecting data and protecting resources, you got to really understand how you're going to get attacked, and frameworks may or may not help that with you. So there's just this lack of people that think about, okay, who's going to attack me, from where, how are they going to attack me, and how am I going to build my defenses to make sure that I'm doing the best job I can stopping them. And so it takes a mindset that's like, there's a bad guy out there who's coming after me. It's not data processing. It's not information technology. It is really security and protecting and defending the resources and the data to which you're entrusted.
Well, that's a really good way to put it, to get people's mindset shifted. We'll go ahead and pop up our second poll question, please. I'll go ahead and read it as it gets booted. Out of the following priorities, please select what you believe to be the most important for your agency. And the options for this poll include modernization, data management, harmonization, data security, and automation. So please go ahead and answer that if you'd like to receive your CPE credit. And if you have any questions for our panelists, please make sure you go ahead and put them in the chat so that we can read them off before we run out of time. Excellent. That being said, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but Robert, how can federal agencies and cloud service providers work together to enhance security? So what are some of the things that you're seeing from collaboration standpoint, or that you would like to see happen in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, collaboration is clutch. I mean, it's everything. But like specific to this question, like what are some of the big priorities? I definitely agree that data security, it needs to be up there. I'm sort of conflicted between the blend of automation and modernization. I think, on a principled level, I tend to favor things that allow you to move faster. I think the faster that you can move, the more you can learn, and the faster you can pivot. You can pivot your way through things, like through the process, and ultimately get to the outcome, whether it's implementing some project or some program or what have you. in a more effective way. Like I think about the way that the Dyson Cyclone vacuum was invented. It was just through all of these like rapid fire iterations. And I think so like I would kind of like blend those two things. And I very much like I tend to favor solutions or approaches to problems that optimize for speed of learning and speed of pivot ability, just because it like you increase your cycle time. It's kind of like starting a software project with an emphasis on continuous delivery. And if you don't break that and you've got like really good developer experience, you're going to end up like being able to release faster, and you're going to have a more stable, resilient product at the end of the day.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And Jeff, I'm going to turn the same question over to you as well. And you come from the industry side. So how can federal agencies as well as industry vendors, work together in order to enhance security when it comes to cloud services?
So I mentioned earlier that the speed of business has gone up orders of magnitude, and we see it all the time. And so I look across 3,500 customers that we have, and I see that there is this bifurcation that's occurring. There is sort of the current way of thinking about data centers and firewalls and client server applications and securing that. And then there's this whole modern way of doing things, which is cloud native, and in many cases uses things like Kubernetes and Istio to modernize applications. New applications are being developed in the modern way. Existing applications are running in the kind of the current way. And the modern way keeps up with the speed of business, so that's what they're trying to do. The current way, it's almost impossible because there's so much that's legacy that's been around, that's there. There's so many processes around it. And so, but the emerging world is the goddess, or the god is speed. And they're rushing out, and we're smack in the middle of this. We're developing at incredibly high speeds, and it's a security solution that needs to morph incredibly quickly. And so the balance there is, how do you go really, really fast? And how do you go really secure at the same time? Because what we know is if you go really fast and you're not secure and you get compromised, you lose. And if you go slow, but you're really secure, you lose. So we actually coined this new word called fast secure. No space, no slash, fast secure. And the companies, the organizations that are winning are going very fast and secure at the same time. What that means is those developing new things have to also think of not only how do I go fast, but how do I innovate and be secure at the same time? And those that are responsible for securing these things have to think, how do I secure it? But while I secure it, how do I speed it up? And so this is a new frontier where these two things come together, and heretofore they've been separate. Security is slow down. You can't do that. Development is go faster. You got to do both simultaneously. And this is the big challenge. So everybody has to have the same incentive structure and the same set of motivations to go very, very fast and to be secure while you're doing the same thing. You think about a Formula One race car. They spent a ton of money on engines. You know what else spent a ton of money on? Brakes. You know why? Because the better your brakes, the faster you can go. And so it's almost counterintuitive, but that's really important. Fast, secure is the way of the future.
I like it. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us. And we're almost out of time. So I want to hear from both of you. What is something that you really want our audience to take away from this conversation, whether you just thought of it during the discussion or you've been trying to hammer home within your own agency or organization? This would be the time to share that. Robert, we'll start with you, please.
Sure. So I think the thing I would really want to drive home is to not do zero trust or any particular part of it just for the sake of doing the buzzword, like implementing a buzzword.
There is a huge tendency to sort of follow the industry trends, which are driven by buzzwords. And, every marketing email you get these days references those buzzwords. So instead, circle back and focus on what are the actual organizational problems you're trying to solve, like zero trust, least privilege, application security. All of these things are means to some end. And you need to understand, everyone needs to understand what problem they're actually trying to solve, what metrics are relevant to solving that problem so you can show progress. And then you kind of work your way back into some of the principles of zero trust, perhaps as a supporting cast player in addressing that problem. And I think you just really don't get sucked into the buzzword. Stay focused on whatever the mission is and the data, the metrics that are going to lead you there. And zero trust, all of this stuff, it's a framework for collecting some set of best practices to do a thing. It's not the end in and of itself. It shouldn't be.
Thank you, Robert. And Jeff, what would you like to leave the audience with?
So in the time that I've been running Venafi for the last 11 years, and we've grown phenomenally, what continually amazes me is how most people don't have a framework for understanding cybersecurity, which is you give access to those that you want to have access, and you block those that you don't want to have access. I mean, it's fundamentally that simple. Now, there's a whole lot of things that fall out of that. But in all cases, it comes down to you've got to identify whatever that entity is, people or machine, that's going to access it. And human identity is getting to be fairly well understood at this point. But the identity of machines, which are faster than humans, which are more capable in so many ways than humans, which are now making decisions for humans autonomously, the notion of those things have to be identified too. And they are real entities. They can act. They have agendas. They can act autonomously. You need to have identities. You need to trust those identities, and you need to use those identities to provide access control, which means you got to authenticate them. You got to use it for access control, and there's got to be a governance layer on it. And that is in and of itself, that is a complete discipline that is nascent and is coming up. It doesn't solve all the problems. It's foundational though. And if you don't have that notion, if you don't have that understanding, humans and machines both need identities, then you've got just an open gate for a lot of bad guys to attack the new modern infrastructure. So that's the one thing, to understand that both humans and machines need identities, and those identities need to be managed and protected.
Well, thank you both. I really appreciate getting the opportunity to sit down and hear from you. I know our audience did too. And that's the end of our summit. So I want to thank again our partners at AppGate, Beyond Trust, Contrast Security, ForgeRock, Fortinet, ForcePoint, iBoss, Ivanti, Menlo Security, Rubrik, Netscope, Palo Alto, Trend Micro, and Venafi. We could not have done this without you all, so we really appreciate it. And as a last little poll, please indicate whether you would like your CPE credit certificate mailed to you or not. And thank you all again, and we look forward to part 2 of our summit, which is tomorrow, all on Zero Trust. Hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Bye.
Thank you all.